She left a king, not because she stopped loving him, but because he stopped seeing her as anything worth keeping. 7 years beside the most feared alpha ruler in the known world, and all it took was one conversation she was never supposed to hear to unravel everything she thought was real. If you've ever given everything to someone who handed you over to convenience without flinching, this story is going to hit somewhere deep. Stay until the end. Drop a like and tell me what city you're watching from. Let's begin. The black ring made no sound when it hit the stone floor of the moon chamber. It didn't shatter, it didn't roll. It simply struck the cold obsidian tile and landed flat, like a period at the end of a sentence that had been too long in coming. In the corridor just behind the war banner, the one embroidered with the crimson wolf of Valtheris devouring a serpent, Queen Seralya stood with her back pressed against ancient stone and her hand still extended from the motion of having removed it. She had worn it for 7 years. She stood there for a long time after the voices inside the moon chamber fell silent. Long after the sound of boots on marble signaled that King Vaeric and his delegation from the Southern Dominion had concluded their negotiations and exited through the Western Arch. Long after the torches in the corridor burned themselves an inch lower and the shadows stretched across the floor like reaching hands. She did not cry. This is worth understanding, not as a testament to her strength, though strength was certainly there, banked like coal in a furnace and burning slow and long, but because there was something in her that simply refused to let grief take that particular shape. Not here. Not in a palace that had spent 7 years teaching her that tears in the wrong corridor were information, and information in the wrong hands was a blade. She had learned to mourn quietly. She had learned to survive loudly. These were the two great lessons of Valtheris. What she felt instead was something that had no clean name. It sat beneath her sternum like a stone that had been swallowed whole. It pressed against the back of her eyes, not with heat, but with a terrible, clarifying cold. She had heard men on the battlefield describe the moment an arrow struck them, that first instant before pain arrived, when the body simply registered impact. Weight, fact. The world rearranged into before and after with no ceremony whatsoever. That was what this was. The empire cannot survive on sentiment. Desire feeds the soul, but alliances feed crowns. Vaeric's voice had been entirely calm when he said it. That was perhaps the worst part. Not cruelty, not even dismissal, but the absolute serenity of a man who had already made peace with the decision before he announced it. He hadn't been apologizing. He hadn't been struggling. He had been explaining the way a general explains the strategic necessity of burning a village that shelters an enemy. She belongs to another season of my life. A king must sacrifice what he loves to preserve what he rules. 7 years. She had stood behind that throne when famine struck the northern provinces, and Vaeric had made decisions that she alone had talked him back from the edge of. She had sat across from him in the war rooms until the candles burned to stubs while they argued strategy, and she convinced him that the eastern border commanders would respond to loyalty better than to terror. She had been the voice he heard before sleep. She had been the first face he wanted to see after campaigns that almost killed him. She had been, in every way that mattered, the other half of the mind that governed Valtheris. And she was a season he was ready to end. She peeled herself off the stone wall and walked back through the servants' corridor, the narrow passage behind the main halls that she had memorized in her second year in the palace because she had understood early that knowing the hidden paths of a place was the difference between sovereignty and dependency. Her footsteps were quiet. Her spine was straight. Her face wore the expression she had spent years perfecting, composed, unreadable, the face of a woman at rest. Inside, the stone pressed harder against her ribs with every step. She reached her chambers, closed the door, stood in the center of the room for a moment with her hands loose at her sides and looked at 7 years accumulated around her. The tapestries she had chosen, the books stacked on the reading table, the silver-framed map of the empire they had marked together with routes and territories, and the small ink notation in Vaeric's handwriting beside the city of Marin that simply said, "Seralya was right, keep this road open." And she understood, in a way that was almost clinical in its completeness, that she had to leave before morning. Not because she was afraid of what she might say to him, because she was afraid of what she might offer to forgive. That was the real danger. She knew herself well enough to know that Vaeric still possessed a kind of gravitational pull over her that she had never fully conquered, and that if she stood in the same room as him before she had put enough distance between herself and what she'd overheard, she would find a way to accept it. She would find the argument that made it survivable. She would stay. And staying, she had just learned, was the thing that would finally finish her. She moved with methodical speed. She took what could fit into a single traveling pack: documents of her own correspondence, currency and hard coin, 2 changes of clothing suited for riding, a small blade she had carried since before she ever set foot in Valtheris. She left the gowns, she left the jewelry, she left the commission scrolls and the advisory letters and the entire architecture of the life she had constructed inside these walls. She left the ring where it had fallen. She found it significant, later, that she didn't retrieve it. That even in the compressed efficiency of her departure, something in her had decided to leave it there. Not as gesture, not as statement, but as simple fact. It had belonged to a version of herself that no longer existed. Carrying it would have been like carrying a language you no longer spoke. She slipped out through the eastern servants' gate at the 4th hour of the night, when the guard rotation created a gap of 7 minutes. She had cataloged this years ago, the way she cataloged everything useful and filed it away without immediate purpose, trusting that the time would come, and disappeared into the dark before the torches on the eastern wall completed their circuit. The imperial citadel of Valtheris, with its obsidian cliffs and silver domes and its rivers of torchlight that could be seen from 30 miles away on a clear night, shrank behind her until it was just a glow on the horizon, indifferent as a dying star. She rode north without looking back. This too was a decision. The spine is a remarkable instrument of will. The instinct to look back at things you are leaving is almost physical. It lives in the muscles of the neck, in the peripheral hunger of the eyes, and resisting it requires a particular kind of deliberate authority over your own body. She did not look back. She kept her eyes on the road ahead, which was dark and deeply uncertain and absolutely hers to navigate alone, and she let the glow diminish behind her at whatever speed the darkness permitted. The alpha who walks away does not walk away clean. This is the lie that comfort tells, that departure is its own relief, that the moment of decision resolves the wound. It does not. The wound travels with you. It sits behind the sternum in the passenger seat of every mile you put between yourself and the thing that caused it, and it does not have the decency to stay quiet. She knew this. She had known it when she left. She left anyway. This was perhaps the most alpha thing she had ever done. Not the power she had wielded in advisory chambers, not the negotiations she had managed, not the enemies she had outmaneuvered, but this. The ability to act correctly while the wound was still open and screaming. Most people wait to feel better before they do the necessary thing. The ones who survive, really survive, the kind of survival that doesn't require them to hollow themselves out to manage it. They do the necessary thing while the pain is still at full volume, because they understand that waiting for silence is the same as waiting forever. She rode through the night. By dawn, she was in the high foothills, and the citadel's glow was gone from the horizon entirely. She let herself stop for exactly 1 hour at a stream that crossed the road between 2 limestone outcroppings. She watered her horse. She ate hard bread from the pack without tasting it. She sat on a rock with her elbows on her knees and stared at the water moving over stones that had been smoothed by 10,000 years of patience, and she thought about the way Vaeric had spoken, not what he'd said. She already knew what he'd said. She was thinking about the quality of his voice, that untroubled certainty, that sovereign distance. And she was doing something she had trained herself to do in moments of crisis, which was to separate what was true from what was painful, because the two were not always the same thing, and conflating them was how good minds went to ruin. What was true? He had made his choice. He had made it before the conversation in the moon chamber, and the conversation was simply the first time she had been positioned to hear the conclusion. He was not a cruel man in the way that petty men are cruel. He was a man who had built an entire identity around the belief that power and personal cost were the same thing, that the willingness to sacrifice what you valued was itself the proof of leadership. He believed genuinely in what he'd said. What was painful, he was right, and what he had sacrificed was her. She sat with that for the full hour. She did not flinch from it, did not dress it up, did not soften the edge of it. This was another survival skill, the ability to look directly at the shape of the wound rather than the shadow of it. Shadows are always more frightening than the objects that cast them. The truth, once faced in full, is merely the truth. It does not grow larger with looking, it simply becomes workable. She wasn't workable yet, but she would be. She stood when the hour ended. She mounted her horse. She rode north. The storm found her on the second day. It came from the northwest with the sudden personal malice of mountain weather. 1 hour of clear sky and the next a wall of gray that swallowed the peaks and descended into the road with a kind of purposeful speed, as though it had been looking for her specifically. Within 20 minutes, the road was invisible beneath 6 inches of new snow, and the temperature had dropped to the edge of dangerous. She had made a miscalculation. She admitted this to herself without ceremony, the way competent people admit their errors, not with self-flagellation, not with the theatrical self-punishment that substitutes for actually learning the lesson, but with simple acknowledgement. She had packed for speed and not for weather. She had assumed the northern roads in early winter would give her more time than they had. She had been wrong. By the time she reached the narrow pass between the Dural Mountains, her hands were losing sensation and her horse was laboring in the drifts. The road in both directions was buried. She knew from her cartographic memory that there was supposed to be a way station 2 miles further north, a rough stone structure the Empire maintained for traders. But 2 miles in the dark that was falling now with the speed of a dropped blade, was not a certain 2 miles. She was calculating. Then she heard the riders behind her, 4 of them, emerging from the tree line to her left, moving with the particular organization of men who had been tracking rather than traveling. They wore no insignia she recognized, which was its own kind of information. In the mountain passes between Valtheris and the northern frontier, unaffiliated men on horseback in a winter storm meant one specific thing: raiders, not soldiers. Worse, in some ways, soldiers had hierarchy and consequence. Raiders had neither. She had 1 blade. She was considering her options with the compressed efficiency of someone who had sat in enough war councils to understand threat calculation when the first rider spoke. "Lost, Your Highness." The honorific was mockery. He'd said it the way a boot says things to a face. "No," she said, "just slower than usual." "Slow suits us fine." He pulled his horse sideways to block the road. The other 3 spread wide in a loose arc. Standard for this terrain, she noted. Cut off retreat without the risk of a pinch point. "What's in the pack?" "Nothing you'd find useful." "I'll judge that." He swung down from his horse. He was a large man, the kind of large that comes from physical labor rather than intention. Broad-shouldered, thick-necked, carrying the casual ease of someone who had done this before and found it straightforward. He had a short sword at his hip and a longer blade across his back. "Step down." She did not step down. "I'll need you to reconsider," she said. He found this amusing. He glanced back at the other 3 and shared a look that said the kind of thing that didn't need words. Then he took a step toward her horse. The arrow took him through the shoulder before he closed the distance. He went down sideways with a sound that was more surprise than pain. The pain would come later, she knew. Pain in the shoulder always staged its arrival. And the 3 riders on horseback all turned in the same direction at the same time, which told her the shot had come from the eastern tree line. Then the mounted soldiers came out of the trees. There were 12 of them, in gray and sea blue liveries she didn't immediately recognize, riding with the organized confidence of a unit that had just executed a planned interception rather than stumbled into one. The raiders, correctly evaluating their arithmetic, made a hasty exit through the drifts in the western direction, dragging their wounded man with them. The leader of the gray riders pulled up beside her. He was not young, late 40s, perhaps 50, with a face that had been shaped by weather and decision in equal measure. His eyes were the particular shade of gray that some northern coastal men have, the color of sea fog, and they held the assessment of someone who looked at a situation and understood it faster than most. "Queen Seralya Valtheris," he said. Not a question. "I'm not certain that title is current," she said. Something moved in his expression. Not quite a smile, but the structural precursor to one. He reached up and removed his hood. Silver hair caught the last gray light of the failing afternoon. "Therion of House Vaerel," he said. "King of the Aurelian coast." She had heard of him, of course. There was not a political mind in the known world that had not heard of Therion of Vaerel, the coastal monarch whose trade routes controlled the movement of half the goods that flowed through the Empire's southern ports. who had fought 3 wars for his throne and won all 3 through a combination of naval mastery and what his enemies called, with grudging respect, an infuriating tendency to think 3 exchanges ahead. He was not Vaeric's ally. He was not Vaeric's enemy. He occupied the more interesting and dangerous position of complete independence from both categories. "Long way from your coast, my lord," she said. "Summit of northern trade lords. I was on my return south when my scouts reported a lone rider in the pass ahead of a raid." He studied her with the direct assessment of a man who wasted neither courtesy nor contempt. "You're traveling without escort." "Evidently. In winter. Through raiders' territory. I had a tight schedule." He looked at her for a long moment. Not the look of a man cataloging a woman, she noted, but the look of someone trying to understand a situation that didn't add up yet. "My camp is 2 miles east," he said finally. "You're welcome to shelter until morning." "Why?" The question seemed to interest him. "Because you're going to lose 3 fingers to frostbite before you find the way station," he said, "and that would be a waste." "A waste of what?" "I don't know yet," he said. "That's what interests me about it." She rode east with his company. His camp was efficient and well-organized in the way that said the man who ran it understood the difference between comfort and function, and chose function without apology. The tents were plain, properly sealed against the cold, arranged with clear lines of sight and access. The soldiers moved with the economy of a unit accustomed to one another. There was no excessive noise, no excessive fire, no unnecessary anything. She was given a tent, a meal, and privacy without being asked whether she wanted these things. This was, she realized, a kind of sophistication she had almost forgotten was possible. The provision of care without the accompanying demand for gratitude that transformed care into transaction. Vaeric had never been cruel with his generosity, but his generosity had always arrived wearing the slight, implicit expectation of reciprocal acknowledgement that was its own kind of weight. She ate the hot food and wrapped her hands around the tin cup of something warm and dark, and considered, with the detached precision of someone taking inventory, where she was and what she had. She had escaped Valtheris without being stopped or followed, which meant either that Vaeric had not yet discovered her absence, unlikely, given that it was now past midnight and he was not a man who accepted her chamber being dark past the 10th hour, or that he had discovered it and chosen not to pursue, which said something she wasn't ready to examine. She had approximately 40 days of currency, depending on conditions. She had no formal destination and no formal allies, having spent 7 years as the trusted interior to a king who had never formalized their arrangement in ways that would have given her claim to anything. This was deliberate, she understood now. Not malicious, or not entirely, but deliberate. Vaeric had always been more comfortable with informal arrangements than documented ones, because documentation created obligations, and obligations, in his taxonomy of power, were threats to his absolute discretion. She had accepted this for years because the arrangement had felt sufficient, because she had trusted the arrangement without needing it legalized. That trust was now the precise measure of her legal exposure. She had left Valtheris with nothing that could not be disputed and nothing that could not be ignored. What she had, and this was not nothing, this was in fact considerable, was herself. The entirety of 7 years of political knowledge, strategic intelligence, economic analysis, administrative architecture. The relationships she had built, the correspondence she had conducted, the understanding she had developed of how kingdoms actually functioned at the level where ideology met supply chains. She carried all of this in her mind, undisputed, undeniable, and entirely portable. She was poor in documents. She was extraordinarily wealthy in capacity. The morning came blue and sharp, the storm spent, and the world outside the tent covered in clean snow that had no memory of the night's violence. She emerged before the camp had fully stirred to find Therion already standing at the edge of the tree line with a cup of something hot, looking south with an expression she couldn't read from distance. He heard her approach and turned without surprise. "You sleep light," she said. "Old habit," he said. "Men who sleep heavy lose things." He offered her the second cup he'd been holding. She hadn't noticed it, and she took it. "Where are you going?" "North. The northern frontier in winter is not going to improve your situation," he said. "Possibly not." "What's in the north?" "Distance," she said. He nodded slowly, as though this was a complete and sufficient answer. She found this remarkable. In her experience, men who asked questions rarely accepted incomplete answers gracefully. They pushed, or they filled the silence with their own assumptions, or they deployed the kind of patient waiting that was itself a form of pressure. Therion simply nodded and drank from his cup and looked back south. "I'm riding back to Aurelian," he said. "The coastal road through the Westermark passes are clear at this time of year. It's a 3-week ride." He paused. "You're welcome to the journey, if north is flexible." "Why?" she asked again. "Because I have a daughter who hasn't spoken more than 40 words at a stretch since her mother died 2 winters ago," he said, without heat or performance, just the flat statement of a fact that had been lived with and not resolved. "And I think you might be the kind of person she would talk to." Seralya looked at him for a moment. "That's an unusual reason to invite someone to travel 3 weeks with your company," she said. "I'm an unusual person." He glanced at her sideways. The almost smile was present again. "You said your title might not be current. In my camp, you're a traveler with sound judgment who survived a raid in a mountain pass with 1 blade and a very steady nerve. That's sufficient standing for any company I keep." She thought about it for the length of time it took to drink half the cup. 3 weeks, she said, "give or take weather. And your men? They know who I am. They know you're a woman who was traveling alone with a blade and a pack in a winter pass and didn't flinch when 4 raiders came out of a tree line," he said. "As far as they're concerned, that's everything relevant." She considered whether this was naivety or sophistication and landed on neither. It was something more specific, a kind of deliberate simplicity that wasn't absence of complexity, but the disciplined removal of it. He had decided what mattered. He had excluded what didn't. There was something in this she had not encountered in a very long time. "All right," she said. The road south to the Westermark was 3 days of mountain descent, cold but navigable, through landscape that was stark and beautiful in the particular way of winter mountain country, the kind of beauty that requires discomfort to access and therefore tends to be experienced honestly. No one brings their performance to a mountain pass in winter. The cold strips it away. She rode near the front of the column beside Therion, and for the first day they spoke very little. This was comfortable in a way she had not expected. Vaeric had always needed conversation, not because he was social, but because he processed through language, and silence around him had always carried the slight charge of unexpressed thought demanding eventual outlet. Riding beside him in silence had been a skill she'd developed, filling it correctly without filling it too much. Riding beside Therion in silence was simply riding in silence. On the second day they spoke. It began about terrain, the road conditions, the rate of the descent, whether the pass that cut 2 days from the journey was passable or whether the storm had closed it. Practical matters. But conversation, like water, finds its level and then seeks lower ground. And by the afternoon they had moved without ceremony into the kind of exchange that bypassed preamble. "You were with Vaeric a long time," he said. Not a probing question, just a statement placed in the space between them, neutral as geography, waiting to be addressed or not. 7 years. "You're not going to tell me why you left." "No, that's fine." A pause. "I won't guess either. Guessing other people's wounds is bad manners." She looked at him. The profile of his face in the afternoon light was weathered and considered, the face of someone who had long ago stopped being interested in how he looked and started being interested in how he thought. "You've been through something similar," she said. "I've been through most categories of loss," he said without self-pity, just the inventory of a man who had tallied and moved on. "My wife was killed in the last war. Not in battle. In the aftermath, when the enemy burned the coastal town where she was overseeing evacuation. She stayed behind to make sure the last fishing boats got away." He was quiet for a moment. "She succeeded. That was very much like her." "I'm sorry," Seralya said. "So am I," he said. "Every day, in a manageable amount." There was a specific kind of wisdom in that phrase. Every day, in a manageable amount, that she filed away with the care she reserved for things that were true and useful simultaneously. Grief did not require resolution. It required management. These were categorically different approaches to the same condition, and only one of them was survivable long-term. She thought about what she was carrying in her own chest, the stone that had not shifted since the moon chamber. and she recognized that she had been treating it like a problem to be solved rather than a weight to be distributed. That was the error. That was why it still pressed as hard as it had that first night. "Your daughter," she said. "How old?" 14. Naiva. His voice changed on the name, not softening exactly, but opening slightly, like a door in a stone wall that was heavier to move than an ordinary door and therefore only moved with intention. She was 12 when her mother died. She processed it by becoming very quiet. She has her mother's stubbornness, which means when she decides how to handle something, she handles it that way and doesn't accept interference. "You've tried interference." "I've tried approximately everything," he said, with the particular exhaustion of a competent person who has discovered that competence is insufficient for certain problems. She's not unkind. She responds to what's necessary. She performs her duties. She's exceptionally sharp, reads everything she can get her hands on, asks questions that make my counsel look slow. But she's alone in a way I don't know how to reach. Seralya watched the road for a moment. What does she read? History, strategy, natural science, everything about the sea. He glanced at her. Why? Because a girl who reads strategy and natural science isn't avoiding the world, she said. She's trying to understand it on her own terms before she engages with it on anyone else's. That's not grief staying closed. That's a very specific kind of preparation. She paused. She's waiting for something she can trust. Therion was quiet for longer than usual. Her mother used to say something similar about her. Then her mother was paying attention. Her mother paid attention to everything, he said. It was one of the things that got her killed, and one of the things I loved most about her, and I have spent 2 years trying to find a way to hold both of those facts simultaneously without one of them destroying the other. This, Seralya thought, was a man who had earned the kind of composure he carried. It wasn't armor. It wasn't distance. It was the hard-won equilibrium of someone who had decided, consciously and repeatedly, to remain present to the full complexity of their experience rather than simplify it into something bearable but smaller. She had not met many people like this. She had been trying for years to become one. Aurelian Keep appeared on the 14th day of the journey, on a morning that came in clear and gold over the sapphire sea. She saw it first from the ridge of the last coastal bluff, a fortress built on a natural rock formation that jutted into the sea like a declaration, its pale stone warm in the early light, its walls following the organic line of the rock rather than imposing geometry upon it. Below, the harbor town spread along the coast with the organized energy of genuine commerce, not the forced tribute economy of Valtheris, but the messy human vitality of a place where trade happened because people wanted it to. She had seen many palaces in her life. She had not seen many places. There was a difference. It's not what I expected, she said. What did you expect? I don't know, something more imposing. It is imposing, he said. From the sea, from the land it's just home. He rode forward without elaborating, which she had learned in 14 days was how he closed a subject when he thought he'd said the complete thing. The welcome at the gates was efficient and warm in the pragmatic way of people who genuinely liked their king, but expressed it through function rather than pageantry. The steward was a compact, sharp-eyed woman named Dorith, who took in Seralya's presence with the single raised eyebrow of someone who had learned to process surprises without broadcasting them, then immediately set to organizing quarters, food, and clean clothing with the smooth authority of someone who had run this household through worse complications. Naiva met them in the inner courtyard. She was exactly what Therion had described, 14, quiet, with her father's gray eyes and her mother's unreported face, wearing a plain dark tunic and carrying a book she had clearly been reading until the moment she heard the horses in the gate and came to stand where she could observe without being observed. She stood at the edge of the courtyard colonnade and watched her father dismount with the focused attention of someone cataloging information rather than expressing emotion. Then she looked at Seralya. It was not the look that children usually gave strangers in royal households, not assessment for threat or rank or what this new person meant for existing arrangements. It was something more specific, direct in a way that adults rarely were. The directness of someone who had not yet fully learned the courtesy of pretending not to see. She walked across the courtyard to her father. Let him put a hand briefly on her shoulder, which she neither invited nor rejected. Then she looked back at Seralya. "You're not wearing your colors," she said. "No," Seralya said. "The traitors talk," Naeva said. "They say you left Valtheris in the middle of the night with one horse and one pack. Your traitors are well informed." "My traitors have a financial interest in knowing which thrones are stable," she said, with the casual precision of a girl who had grown up in a trading kingdom and absorbed its epistemology as native language. "Is Valtheris stable?" "Naeva," Therion said, with the mild tone of a father who found his daughter's directness both necessary and occasionally inconvenient. "It's a fair question," Seralya said. She looked at the girl. "Valtheris is stable. The throne has its succession arranged and its alliances secured. Just not the one it should have kept," Naeva said. The silence after this was the particular kind of silence that forms around a truth stated by someone too young to know they were supposed to leave it unstated. Therion cleared his throat. Naeva looked at him with an expression that understood perfectly that she had said the whole thing out loud, then looked back at Seralya with something that might have been the first careful edge of an apology. Not for the truth, but for the manner. "I read a lot," she said. "Your father mentioned," Seralya said. "He says it like it explains things. Doesn't it?" Naeva considered this with the seriousness she apparently brought to all questions. "Sometimes," she said, "but it also raises more questions than it answers, and most adults find that inconvenient." "I find it useful," Seralya said. Another silence, this one different in quality from the last. Tentative, testing, the kind that forms between two people who have both identified something recognizable in the other and are deciding whether to acknowledge it. "Dorith has rooms on the East Wing," Naeva said finally. "The East Wing gets the morning light." "I prefer morning light," Seralya said. "I know," Naeva said, and walked back toward the colonnade with her book, which was the most sovereign exit Seralya had witnessed in recent memory. In the weeks that followed, Aurelian revealed itself to her the way good places do, not through declaration, but through accumulation. She attended the morning councils at Therion's invitation, initially as observer, and then, gradually and without formalization, as participant. The council itself was a mixed body of merchants, harbor masters, agricultural representatives from the coastal territories, and two military commanders who had served through all three of Therion's wars and wore their experience with the quiet authority of people who had nothing left to prove. They were initially cautious around her. This was reasonable. She was a political unknown. She carried the residue of a rival king's court, and caution toward unknowns was what had kept these men and women functional through considerable historical turbulence. She did not perform for them. She observed. She asked questions when she had them, and held her assessments until they were complete, and when she offered them with the spare economy of someone who had learned in Vaeric's war rooms that every word spoken was information distributed, and information distributed should be worth the distributing. By the fourth week, they were directing questions to her before Therion had finished his. Naeva had taken to arriving in the library where Seralya spent her evenings with a book, and sitting at the far table, far enough to preserve the formal distance, close enough to be in the same room. She didn't ask for conversation. She didn't offer it. She read, and occasionally she made sounds that were not quite words, but were clearly responses to things she was encountering on the page. And sometimes Seralya looked up and said, "What is it?" And sometimes Naeva answered, and sometimes she didn't, and neither of these outcomes disrupted the texture of the evening. The girl was, Seralya had determined, one of the more genuinely intelligent people she had met in a life that had included considerable exposure to the range of human intelligence. Not the performed intelligence of people who had been told they were smart and learned to display it, but the working intelligence of someone who was constantly trying to solve problems that interested her. The grief in her was real and present. Not healed, probably not going to be neatly healed, but it wasn't consuming her. It was doing what grief does in strong people. It was becoming substrate, ground, the thing under the ground upon which other things grew. It was on the 31st day that the rider from Valtheris arrived. He came under truce banner, a single rider, imperial colors barely visible under road dust, exhausted horse, and an expression that suggested he had been riding at maximum sustainable speed for as long as the animal had physically permitted. He presented himself at the gate with credentials from the imperial court, and was admitted to the great hall, where Therion received him with Seralya present at the far end of the room in the capacity she had occupied for the past month. Present, observing, not formally announced. The writer was a young man she half recognized from Valtheris, one of the junior court scribes, she thought, the kind of functionary who is precise and reliable and invisible, and therefore useful for exactly this kind of errand. He bowed to Therion with the ceremony of his credentials. Then his eyes found Seralya across the room and stayed there, and his composure shifted in the small, specific way of a man trying to decide whether to address the thing he had not been briefed to address in front of the person he had been briefed to address. "State your business," Therion said. The writer reached inside his coat and produced a sealed document. The seal was the Crimson Wolf of Valtheris. He presented it to Therion. "Trade negotiation, my lord. King Vaeric proposes preliminary terms for the spring summit." Therion looked at the document. Then he looked at the writer. His expression had the quality of a man reading the text beneath the text, with the ease of long practice. "A long ride for preliminary terms," he said. "The king is eager to establish the framework before the summit, my lord." "Is he?" Therion broke the seal. He read for a moment. His expression did not change, but something in his posture, the slight stillness that she had learned meant he was processing something larger than his face was reporting, told her the document was not primarily about trade. He looked up at the writer. "Tell King Vaeric that House Varel will consider the terms and respond before the month's end." The writer bowed. His eyes went to Seralya one more time. Involuntary, the glance of a man with instructions he was choosing not to execute openly. And then he was escorted out. Therion waited until the hall doors closed. Then he crossed the room and handed her the document. It was in its opening pages exactly what the writer had described: trade terms, river routes, port access, standard framework language for the kind of agreement the coastal kingdoms negotiated twice a decade. She read through it with the practiced speed of someone who had reviewed hundreds of such documents and filed the substance away while searching for the actual purpose. She found it on the third page. It was a clause embedded in the standard hospitality language that accompanied any official summit proposal. The section that addressed the accommodation of respective courts during the summit period and requested confirmation of all members of the hosted delegation. It was, by design, exactly the kind of bureaucratic language that was read by secretaries and not principals. But she had spent 7 years in Vaeric's court. She read it twice. "He knows," she said. "He knew before this writer left Valtheris," Therion said. "The question is what he plans to do about it." She looked at the clause again. Embedded in the delegation list request was a sentence, routine in form, weighted in implication, that asked for confirmation of all current residents of Aurelian Keep in advisory or diplomatic capacity. It was not a trade negotiation. It was an inventory. He was counting what he'd lost. And in that counting, she could read his methodology as clearly as she could read his handwriting, 7 years being sufficient to understand how a mind operated even when it tried to operate indirectly. She could see the shape of something beginning to move, something large, something that he had likely been persuading himself against for the past month, something that his pride in his throne and the fact of his recent marriage and the public face of his power had all been arguing against, and that some other part of him, the part that had placed a ring on her hand during their nameless youth and meant it with a sincerity that had nothing to do with strategy, had been arguing for. He was coming. Not yet. The summit was months away, and he would observe the formalities because he was not a man who discarded form without calculation. But he was coming. She could see it in the document the way she had seen his decisions forming a dozen times before in the architecture of his careful, controlled language. He had made the inquiry that preceded the decision. He was building the case that he could not build directly, and so was building sideways, as he always did. The Alpha does not retreat. He repositions. He reevaluates ground, identifies new approach vectors, commits to his objective with a patience that can look to the uncareful observer like acceptance. Vaeric had never accepted anything. She set the document on the table and stood in the golden late afternoon light of Aurelian's great hall. This place that was not iron, this place that moved and breathed and functioned like something alive rather than something defended. And she looked at the sea framed in the high window, the sapphire sea that had no memory of Valtheris and no politics and no kings. And then Therion spoke from behind her, his voice carrying the carefully neutral quality of a man choosing his register. "Do you want to tell me what that clause means?" he said. "Or do you want to let me pretend it's about trade for another hour?" She turned. His face held the thing she had come to recognize in him, the absolute honesty of a man who had decided, somewhere in the loss of his life, that pretense was a cost he could no longer afford. He was not asking her to perform. He was asking her to be present to the actual situation. "It means Vaeric knows I'm here," she said, "and he's decided to do something about it." Therion nodded slowly. "What does he want?" She looked at him across the length of the room. This king who had rebuilt after catastrophic loss, who ruled without domination, who had placed a cup of hot liquid in her frozen hands in a mountain pass and asked for nothing in return, who had a daughter who read strategy and natural science and was waiting for something she could trust. And she gave him the honest answer. "He wants what he gave away," she said. "And he hasn't figured out yet that giving something away isn't the same as losing it. You lose something by accident. You give it away by choice." She paused. The difference matters. Therion was quiet for a long time. Outside, the sea moved against the coastal rock with the patient, unhurried power of something that had been at this for a very long time and planned to continue. "And you?" he said finally. "What do you want?" She opened her mouth to answer, and the second rider arrived in the outer courtyard. The sound of it reached them through the hall's high windows, hooves on stone, urgent, a single horse running too hard for the cobblestones. A shout from the gate guard, a name she couldn't make out. Then Dorith's voice, sharp and close, outside the hall doors. The doors opened. Dorith's expression was the controlled face of a woman delivering news she had already categorized as significant. "My lord," she said, addressing Therion but looking at them both. "A second rider from the north, not Valtherian colors." She paused. "Lord Commander Dravish of the eastern border." Seralya went still. She knew Dravesh. She knew what he commanded. She knew what a rider from the eastern border meant under any circumstances, and what it meant specifically now, in the specific political geography of a moment when Vaeric was already conducting an inventory of what he had lost and beginning to move pieces on a board that was larger than a trade summit. Therion looked at her. She was already looking at the door. "Bring him in," she said. Therion said nothing for a moment, then, "This is your call to make." She looked at him. He said it with such complete simplicity that it took a moment to process, not the false humility of a man performing deference, not the calculated neutrality of a man protecting his position, but the genuine statement of a sovereign who had decided that the situation belonged to her and was standing aside from it without extraction of cost. She had spent 7 years beside a man who had never once said that to her. The door opened. The rider was dusty and hollow-eyed and carrying a message cylinder with a seal she recognized, the black ring and cross blades of Dravesh's personal command. And as he crossed the floor toward her, she understood, with the clarity that had been her companion since the moon chamber, and would apparently continue to be her companion through whatever came next, that the season Vaeric believed had ended was not over. It was just beginning in a different direction. The rider stopped in front of her. He opened the cylinder. She read the message once. Then she looked up at Therion, and for the first time since the mountain pass, the composure she had carried like a second skin cracked at one specific edge. Not grief this time, not the stone behind the sternum, but something sharper and more immediate. "Vaeric's Eastern Army," she said, "has already moved." The message was 11 lines long. Seralya had read it once, and that was sufficient, because she was the kind of reader who understood not just what words said, but what the act of writing them meant. The decisions that preceded them, the calculation behind their construction, the specific intelligence of the man who had written them, and what he was telling her between every line he had set down on paper. Dravesh had not written this message to inform her. He had written it to warn her. There was a difference. And it was the difference between a military commander fulfilling his duty to a queen who had technically lost her title and a military commander choosing, under conditions where that choice was not without personal risk, to remain loyal to the person rather than the position. Dravesh had served Valtheris for 23 years. He had served under Vaeric for 15 of them. He had been, in Seralya's estimation, one of the most scrupulously professional men in the Empire's military apparatus, loyal to the throne, not to its occupant, in the way that the best soldiers always are. That he had sent this message told her something about what was happening in Valtheris that the message itself did not say. She looked up at Therion. How long ago did this rider leave? The rider answered before Therion could. 8 days, my lady. I rode the coastal road as far as the Westermark Junction, then cut south. Where was Vaeric's eastern army when Dravesh sent you? Assembled at the Keldren Pass staging post, 60 miles from the Varel border. Therion's expression had not changed in the specific way that said he was running calculations. 60 miles at march pace in winter conditions, 11 days minimum, 14 if the snow holds. The snow is holding, the rider said. Then we have 3 days, Seralya said. She set the message on the table with the focused precision of a woman placing a final piece in a configuration she could already see complete. Maybe 4. The room was quiet for a moment, with the specific quality of quiet that forms around a decision that has not yet been made but is already inevitable. Therion looked at her with the direct, unperformed attention she had come to recognize as his natural register. 3 days for what, exactly? To decide what this is, she said, before it becomes something we can't shape. This was the thing that most people didn't understand about political crises, that the window in which they were workable was narrow, and it narrowed fast, and the people who survived them were not the people who responded most forcefully, but the people who understood the geometry of the window before it closed. Vaeric's eastern army moving was not yet a war. It was a gesture at the scale of an army, which was a particular kind of threat designed to create the conditions under which the threatened party made a mistake. She knew this because she had sat in rooms where Vaeric designed exactly this kind of gesture. She knew precisely how it worked, and she knew, which was the piece of knowledge that pressed hardest on her right now, exactly what he wanted her to do. He wanted her to run. Not because he wanted her gone, the message made clear enough that the opposite was true, but because, in Vaeric's tactical language, a fleeing target was a target that had abandoned its ground and was therefore negotiable. A person who ran confirmed their vulnerability. A person who ran gave the pursuing party the first definition of the terms. She had spent her entire escape from Valtheris running. She was finished running. Leave us, she said to the rider. He looked at Therion. Therion nodded once. The rider went. She stood in the great hall of Aurelian Keep with the fading afternoon gold on the floor between her and a king who had given her shelter and asked for nothing, and was now, through no fault of any choice he'd made, standing in the shadow of another man's army because she was standing inside his walls. She owed him honesty. She gave it to him. He's not coming for territory, she said. He doesn't want a war with the coast. The Eastern Army is leverage, not invasion. Leverage for what? She held his gaze. For me. Therion said nothing. His expression held the stillness she had catalogued, the processing stillness, the stillness of a man who had just been handed the full picture and was aligning it with the partial picture he had already assembled. The trade document, he said, the inventory clause. He wanted to know if I was here before he committed the army to movement. The rider would have passed the army staging at Keldran on his way north. The timing is deliberate. She paused. He knows I understand the timing. He wants me to know he knows I understand it. So it's a conversation, Therion said. It's a demand dressed as a conversation, she said, which is how he operates. He creates conditions that make compliance appear to be free choice. Therion walked slowly to the window that faced the sea. He stood there for a moment with his hands behind his back, looking at the horizon where the light was going amber and slow. And what does compliance look like in this case? She had been asking herself this question since she read the message. The answer she kept arriving at was the one she least wanted to say out loud, because saying it out loud would make it a real option, and real options had to be weighed rather than rejected by instinct alone. It looks like me going back, she said. And if you don't? Then the Eastern Army reaches the border and Vaeric has to decide whether to press the leverage or fold it. If he presses, you have a war with Valtheris that benefits no one and costs this coast considerably. If he folds, he loses face in front of his generals and his new bride's political allies, which destabilizes the alliance that was the entire reason for— She stopped. She had not said this part out loud yet, not to Therion, not to anyone. For ending things with you, Therion said quietly. Yes. He turned from the window. His face in the amber light had the worn, honest quality of a man who had been too long past performance to return to it now. "What do you want to do?" "I want to burn the message and pretend the writer never arrived," she said. "That's what I want. What I'm going to do is different." "Tell me." "I'm going to write to Vaeric directly," she said. "Not through diplomats, directly. I'm going to tell him that his army can winter at Keldrin until the snow melts and the trade routes open and the summit convenes, and that we will speak at the summit as sovereigns in a neutral setting, and that sending 60 miles of soldiers to the doorstep of an allied coast over a personal matter is the kind of decision that history does not remember kindly." Therion considered this for a moment. "That's not a rejection." "No. It's also not compliance." "It's a boundary," she said, stated clearly and without apology. He doesn't encounter those often. They tend to get his attention. Something moved in Therion's expression, not quite amusement, but close to its structure. Then it passed, and what was underneath was more serious. "Seralya." He said her name without title or decoration, the way people say names when they mean what follows to reach a person rather than a position. "I need to ask you something, and I need an honest answer." "All right." "Do you still love him?" The great hall held the question in its stone walls the way stone walls hold temperature, slowly, thoroughly, without release. She had been asked this question by herself, in the dark hours of the past month, more times than she had answered it. She had asked it of herself the way you probe a wound for depth, not wanting to find it bottomless, finding it bottomless anyway, working with that information. "It doesn't matter," she said. "It matters to me," Therion said. This was the moment she understood, fully, in the complete register, without the partial understanding she had been managing until now, that Therion of Vaeric had not offered her shelter and conversation and council membership and the quiet, reliable warmth of his company for 31 days simply because he had a daughter who needed someone to talk to. She looked at him. He did not look away. "Yes," she said, "some version of it. The version of him that existed before the moon chamber." She paused. "But love doesn't obligate me to go back to a place where what I am is only visible in private and erased in public. Love is not a sufficient reason to accept that." "No," he said, "it isn't." "You knew about the moon chamber," she said, "before I told you." "I had enough intelligence from Valtheris to understand the shape of why you'd left," he said. "I didn't know the specific conversation, but the timing of your departure against the timing of the Southern marriage announcement was not subtle, and I have good people watching the empires around me. And you still offered me the journey. I offered you a cup of hot liquid in a mountain pass because you were about to lose 3 fingers," he said. "Everything after that was your choice." She stood very still for a moment. This was the thing about Therion. He operated from such a clear understanding of consent and agency that it sometimes produced in her a kind of vertigo, because she had spent 7 years in an environment where the powerful man in the room always, inevitably, made the thing you chose seem like the thing he had arranged for you to choose. Not out of malice, out of the simple gravity of how he occupied space. Vaeric didn't have to manipulate. He just existed at a scale that made the landscape tilt toward him. Therion existed at a scale that kept the landscape level. She had not known, until she stood on level ground, how long she had been walking on a tilt. "I need to write the message," she said. "The writing room is open," he said. And then, with the perfect economy that she was beginning to understand was his natural precision, "I'll be in the harbor until you're done." He left. She wrote for 2 hours, not because the message itself was long. When she was finished, it was 7 sentences, which was the right length for a message of this kind, which was to say a message that carried enormous weight and therefore needed to carry it without additional words that would give the recipient something to argue with. Short messages from people you have underestimated tend to land harder than long ones. She knew this because she had watched Vaeric use it. She wrote the 7 sentences, and then she set the quill down and read them back, and they were correct. Not kind, not cruel, not emotional, just correct. The way a structural support is correct when it's load-bearing and doesn't have the luxury of being decorative. She sealed it with no insignia, no title, no house, no emblem, just her name. She found Dorith and gave her the message and the instructions for the writer, and Dorith received these with the same raised eyebrow composure she apparently applied to all information, and said she would see it dispatched within the hour. Then Seralya walked down to the harbor. Therion was standing at the end of the longest dock with his hands in his coat, and his face turned to the last of the evening light on the water, and she walked out to him because the dock was long and narrow, and there was only one direction to walk, which felt appropriate. She stood beside him. The sea was doing what it always did, moving, breathing, completely indifferent to the human beings standing above it and their considerable difficulties. "I sent it," she said. "Good. Now we wait to see which Vaeric receives it," she said. "The king or the man. Is there a difference?" "On most days, no," she said. "That's the problem." They stood there in the cold for a while in the silence that she had stopped trying to fill, because she had learned that silence with Therian was not empty. It was the same kind of silence as the productive stillness between two people who were thinking independently and didn't feel the need to perform companionship over the top of it. She understood something standing there. The thing about surviving a catastrophic wound, and she had spent 31 days in the careful company of a man who had survived one, and she was somewhere in the middle of her own, was that the survival itself changed the shape of what you were capable of wanting. People who had not been through it often assumed that grief and loss narrowed the survivor, made them smaller, more cautious, less available to the full range of human experience. This was wrong. The grief burned out the inessential. It left the core, what actually mattered, what you actually were when there was nothing left to perform. And the core, in people who had enough of it to survive, was not small. She was not small. She had been living in a palace that never quite fit, and she had walked out of it into a mountain pass in winter, and she had ridden 3 weeks across difficult country, and she had arrived in a place that fit with the unnerving, uncomplicated accuracy of a key in a lock she hadn't known existed. This terrified her, not because she distrusted it, because she trusted it completely, and she had learned 7 years earlier that trusting something completely was a form of exposure she hadn't yet figured out how to make safe. "I need to tell you something," she said. Therian waited. "I'm not whole," she said. "I know that's not a surprising observation given the circumstances, but I want to be clear about it rather than let you work with an inaccurate inventory. I'm functioning at a high level, and I know my own mind, and I can tell the difference between what's grief and what's judgment, but there are things I am still not ready for." Therian was quiet for a moment. "I'm not asking you for anything." "I know you're not," she said. "That's part of why I'm saying it." He looked at her. The sea fog gray of his eyes in the evening light had the quality of something that had seen enough to be past urgency. "You think if I'm not asking, the statement is unnecessary. I think if you're not asking, the statement needs to be made more carefully," she said. "Because the absence of a demand doesn't mean the absence of—" She stopped. "Of what?" he said. She looked at the water. "Of something that deserves to be acknowledged honestly." The silence after this was the most deliberate silence she had ever stood inside. Therian did not move. He did not fill it. He let it exist at its full size without attempting to manage it, which was the most sophisticated response possible to what she had just said, because any words would have been either too much or not enough. And he understood this. She found herself, despite everything, almost laughing. "You're impossible to manage," she said. "I've been told," he said. "How do you do that?" "Do what?" "Know exactly when to say nothing." He looked back at the sea. "I had a wife who talked," he said, "in the way that very intelligent people talk, constantly, brilliantly, more than most people could follow. And I learned, over 20 years, that the gift I could give her that no one else could was the space to think without having to compete for it." He paused. "It became a habit. Now I do it with everyone." She thought about this. "I think," she said carefully, "that I have been competing for space to think for 7 years without knowing that was what I was doing." "I know," he said. "I could tell when you arrived. You'd get to the end of a thought and then look around just for a half second, like you were checking whether someone was going to finish it for you." She had not known she did this. She stood with that information for a moment and felt it settle into the taxonomy of things she was still learning about herself, which was a longer list than she would have preferred. "Naeva asked me something this morning," she said. "I'm not surprised. She asks things. She asked me if I was going to leave." "What did you tell her?" "I told her I didn't know yet." She paused. She said that was a more honest answer than most adults gave her, and then she went back to her book. But before she left, she said— She stopped. She had not been going to say this part. Then she decided that she was. She said she hoped I stayed. She said the East Wing hasn't been warm enough in the mornings since her mother died. Therion was very still. She hasn't said her mother's name out loud, he said after a moment, in 8 months. Seralya said nothing. He reached up and pressed 2 fingers briefly against his forehead, not a gesture of weakness, but of the specific kind of gratitude that's too large for ordinary expression and finds the body instead. Then he lowered his hand and looked back at the sea and breathed. 31 days, he said quietly. She's ready, Seralya said. She was ready before I arrived. She was just waiting for the right conditions. What conditions? Someone who didn't need anything from her, she said. Someone who showed up without a requirement attached. He looked at her. She looked back. The harbor held them in its cold, ordinary evening. The boats at their moorings, the water against the pilings, the last of the light going out over the sea in horizontal bands of gold and copper and the deep, clear blue that comes just before dark. This was 3 days before the second rider arrived. The first morning after the message went north to Keldrin Pass, Aurelian's council met with a new tension in the room. Not panic, nothing as uncontrolled as panic, but the particular quality of men and women who had received new information and were trying to place it correctly against their existing plans. She had briefed them on the army's movement and the message she had sent, and they had responded with the range of reactions that informed people always produce. 2 of them argued for immediate military mobilization. One proposed diplomatic outreach to Valtheris' council of nobles who were not loyalists, and the harbor master, an old woman named Kaer, who had been managing Aurelian's maritime traffic for longer than most of the council had been alive, said nothing for the entirety of the meeting, and then, at the end, said only, "It's not the army that's going to decide this." Everyone looked at her. "It's never the army," Kaer said. "The army is noise. The question is whether the man behind the noise believes what he's doing, or whether he's doing it because he can't figure out how to stop." She looked at Seralya. "You know him. Which is it?" Seralya held the old woman's gaze. She thought about Vaeric. Not the public king, not the sovereign of her 7 years, but the specific private machinery of the man she had known when the throne room was empty and the candles were low, and he was just a person trying to figure out whether the decisions he'd made were survivable. She thought about the quality of his certainty in the moon chamber, the serenity that had been the first cut. "He believed it when he said it," she said. "He no longer believes it. That's more dangerous than if he'd never meant it, because now he's operating from shame, and shame in an alpha makes the threat unpredictable." "Unpredictable how?" one of the military commanders asked. "Because shame doesn't have a strategic objective," she said. "Power operates from goals. Shame operates from relief. He doesn't need to win. He needs to stop feeling what he's feeling, and the fastest path to that is the one he can't take, which is reversing what he did." The room processed this. "Can he reverse it?" Therion asked. He asked it the way he asked everything, directly, without embellishment, with the specific economy of a man who knew that the answer to some questions contained the entire shape of the problem. "Not without cost," she said. "The southern marriage is politically sealed. The alliance holds territory and gold fleets he can't release without triggering the very instability he secured it to prevent. He can't undo the treaty. He can't give back the season." She paused. "What he can do is show up and ask to be seen. That's what the army is really saying. It's 60 miles of I'm here and I know you're here and I can't pretend otherwise." Kaer made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "Loudest apology I've ever seen." Seralya said nothing. She was thinking about whether the metaphor was right, and she decided it was partly right. But there was another layer beneath the apology, a layer that was more complicated and more dangerous, and she was choosing whether to say it in this room. She said it. "He also believes that if he shows enough force," she said, "I'll come back on his terms. Not because he wants to coerce me, because he's never—" She stopped, chose the next words with care. "He's never had to ask for something he wanted without having the structural power to shape the conditions of the asking. He doesn't know how to want something he can't arrange." She looked around the table. "He's learning it right now. That's the most volatile thing in this situation, not the army, not the politics. A powerful man learning late that there are things he cannot arrange." The council meeting ended with a decision to quietly mobilize one of Therion's 3 naval squadrons. Not to threaten, not to antagonize, but to have them positioned in the coastal waters where they were visible from the northern approach routes. Not a weapon, a reminder. Seralya watched Tharion give the order with the contained authority of a man who made military decisions the way he made all decisions, without theater, without the performance of dominance that was so common among men of his rank, simply with the clear statement of what was necessary and the expectation that people would execute it because they understood why. She understood, watching him, what she had been trying to name for 31 days. He was not the opposite of Vaeric. He was not lesser or greater. He was a different answer to the same problem, the problem of what a person does with power when they have it, what they let it cost them, what they refuse to let it cost. Vaeric had decided, somewhere early in his sovereignty, that power required the suspension of personal vulnerability, that a king who allowed his own need to be visible was a king who gave his enemies a target. He had built the entire architecture of his rule on the premise that invulnerability was strength. He was wrong. Invulnerability was not strength. It was rigidity. And rigidity, under sufficient pressure, did not bend. It broke. Tharion had been broken once and had rebuilt himself from the break, not around the wound, but through it, so that the healed structure included the scar as load-bearing rather than hidden. He governed from that scar. It was the source of his patience, his stillness, his ability to hold the full complexity of a situation without needing to simplify it into something manageable. The alpha who survives loss does not survive by pretending the loss did not occur. He survives by integrating it, by allowing it to become information rather than injury. This was the difference between a man who ruled from fear and a man who ruled from understanding, and it was not a small difference. It was the entire difference. She was thinking about this on the second morning when Naeva found her in the library before the household had fully woken and sat across from her at the large table and opened a book without preamble. They read in silence for half an hour. Then Naeva said, without looking up, "Are you afraid of him?" Seralya did not ask which him. There was only one him in the architecture of this question. "No," she said. "Then why did you leave?" She looked at the girl. Naeva was still reading or performing reading. Her eyes were on the page, but her attention was elsewhere, which was a thing Seralya recognized as a protective device, the way a person asks the important question while looking somewhere else, because the answer is easier to receive when you're not making eye contact with it. "Because staying would have required me to accept being invisible," she said. "And I'm not good at invisible." Naeva turned a page she hadn't read. "My mother wasn't good at invisible either." "What was she good at?" "Everything that required being seen," Naeva said. She said invisibility was a choice some women made because the world made visibility too expensive. She said she refused to pay that price. She paused. And then the war came, and she went to the evacuation, and she made sure everyone else got on the boats, and she stopped. The library was very quiet. "She was seen," Seralya said. "At the end, by everyone who got onto those boats." Naeva's jaw tightened with the specific tension of someone who was not going to cry in front of another person and had the will to maintain that position. "I know," she said. "My father says that's the version I should keep." "It's the true version." "All the versions are true," Naeva said. She looked up. Her eyes were dry and direct and older than 14, the way eyes become older when they have been required to hold things that are too large for ordinary experience. That's what people don't say. They want you to choose the version that doesn't hurt, as if that makes the other versions disappear. Seralya held her gaze for a moment. "Your mother would have liked you enormously," she said. Naeva looked back at her book. Her jaw unclenched a fraction. "I know," she said. It was not arrogance. It was something that sounded like, "I hold this close because it's what I have." They read for another hour. That was the morning of the second day. On the third afternoon, Tharion found her on the coastal wall that ran along the southern edge of the keep, where she had taken to walking when she needed to think in horizontal space, and he had 2 cups of something hot, and he gave her one without asking. She took it. "Rider from the north," he said. She felt the stone behind her sternum shift slightly. "Keldrin?" "No." He looked out at the sea. "Valtheris City. Imperial courier, not military." She looked at him. "It's addressed to you," he said. "Directly. No diplomatic wrapper. Just your name." He held it out. She took the message cylinder. smaller than she expected, plain bronze with no insignia, and opened it. Vaeric's handwriting. Not the official hand, not the trained court script he used for documents. The private hand, slightly angled, slightly crowded at the margin, the handwriting of a man who thought faster than he wrote. She had read 100 letters in this hand. She recognized it the way you recognize a voice in the dark. It was 4 sentences. She read them once. Then she stood very still on the coastal wall with the cold wind coming off the sea and the sound of gulls and the distant sound of the harbor moving through its daily business below. "What does it say?" Therion asked. She lowered the message. She looked at the sea for a long moment, and she thought about seasons, and she thought about what it meant when a man who had never in his life asked for something he couldn't arrange sat down and wrote 4 sentences in his private hand and sent them with no diplomatic wrapper and just her name. "He's coming himself," she said. "Not the army. Not a delegation." She paused. "He dissolved the Eastern deployment. He's coming alone." Therion absorbed this. "And the other 3 sentences?" he asked. She looked at the message in her hand. She looked at Therion, this man on level ground who had given her a cup in a mountain pass and a space to think and 31 days of the most honest company she had encountered in 7 years. She read the last 3 sentences aloud. "I do not come to reclaim. I come because I owe you a conversation we should have had before the moon chamber, and I will not let cowardice be the last word between us. I have already lost the argument. I am asking only for the chance to hear what I should have been listening to all along." The sea moved against the rock below. Therion was quiet for a long time. Then he looked at her, not with the careful neutral assessment she had grown accustomed to, but with something underneath it, something she had not seen in his face before. Something that had the structure of a man who had been patient and honest and present and was now standing in a moment that would determine which direction everything that had grown in 31 days would fall. "Seralya," he said. She looked at him. "When he arrives," he said, "whatever you decide, it needs to be yours, not a reaction to him, not a resistance to him. Yours." "I know," she said. "She is—" "I'm not certain you do," he said. "Not yet. Because you've spent 7 years making decisions inside his gravity, and 2 of those decisions were to accept something you shouldn't have accepted, and the 3rd decision was to leave, which was right. But leaving and arriving are different things." He paused. "You've left. I'm asking you. Have you arrived?" The question landed in her the way honest questions land, not with impact, but with depth. The way a stone falls not against the surface, but through it, down into the part of you that doesn't have prepared answers. She opened her mouth. She closed it. She looked at the sea and felt the wind and stood on the wall of Aurelian Keep, where she had arrived 31 days ago, with frostbitten hands and a single pack and a stone behind her sternum and nothing else that was legally hers. She thought about 7 years. She thought about the moon chamber. She thought about a ring on a cold floor. She thought about a girl in a library who said all the versions are true. She turned to answer him, and the keep's bell tower rang the harbor signal, 1 long, 2 short. The signal for an approaching vessel under royal colors. They both looked south. On the gray sea, still a mile out, but unmistakable in the flat winter light. A single ship. No fleet. No escort. Running the sea blue and silver of Valtheris alone on the open water. He had not waited for the land route. He had come by sea. He was already here. The ship was a single-masted coastal runner. Fast, lean, built for speed over endurance. The kind of vessel that a man chooses when he wants to arrive before his own second thoughts can overtake him. Seralya had stood at the wall long enough to watch it clear the outer harbor markers and begin its approach to the main dock, and she had used that time to do what she did with all information that arrived faster than she was prepared for. She cataloged it without reacting, filed the facts in sequence, and waited for the full picture to assemble before she decided what shape her response would take. Vaeric had crossed open winter sea in a coastal runner with what appeared to be a crew of 8 and no military escort. This was either the most honest thing he had ever done or the most calculated. In her experience, with this particular man, it was almost always both simultaneously, and the task was never to choose between the interpretations but to hold them together and navigate accordingly. Therion said nothing as they watched the ship. He stood beside her with his cup and his steady breathing and his complete absence of performance, and she was aware, with a precision that she could not have achieved 31 days ago, of how much of her current capacity to think clearly was a function of having been in his company. The bell tower rang twice more. The harbor crews below began their routine. Lines, fenders, the organized noise of a dock receiving an unscheduled arrival. "I'll meet him in this great hall," she said. "All right." "Alone?" Therian looked at her. Not with objection, with the question that preceded either agreement or disagreement, the look of a man taking in the full statement before responding to it. "Alone," he repeated. "It needs to be without an audience," she said. "Anything he says in front of witnesses becomes a position he has to maintain. What I need from this conversation can only happen if there's no throne room around it." He considered this for a moment. "And if he comes with leverage you didn't account for?" "Then I'll manage it." "Seralya." He said her name again in that specific register, the one that meant what follows is not performance. "You don't have to prove that you can manage him alone. You've already left. You've already survived the mountain pass. You don't have anything left to prove to anyone." She looked at him and felt the complete complicated truth of what he was saying, and also felt beneath it the specific knowledge that she did not need to explain to him, that this was not about proving anything, that this was about the fact that certain conversations could only be honest in private, and that honesty was the only thing she had left to ask from Vaeric that might mean something. "I know," she said, "but I'm asking for the room." He handed her his cup. She took it, finished it, handed it back. "I'll be in the war room with Kaer and the commanders," he said. "Not far." She walked down from the wall. The great hall of Aurelian Keep in the late afternoon light was a different room than it was in the morning. The light came in lower, longer, cutting across the stone floor in bands that made the space feel both larger and more intimate, the way fading light tends to collapse distance. She did not rearrange it. She stood near the center of it, away from the head table, away from any structural suggestion of hierarchy. If this conversation was going to be honest, it would be conducted between two people standing in the same light. She heard the outer doors open. She heard footsteps she knew. There is a specific phenomenon, well documented in the experience of people who have separated from someone they loved under difficult conditions, where the return of that person's physical presence collapses time in a way that nothing else can replicate. 7 weeks of carefully constructed distance, of deliberate emotional architecture, of the daily work of reorienting herself. All of it held until the doors opened and Vaeric walked in, and then some deep, involuntary part of her experienced a split second of before the moon chamber recognition, before the rest of her caught up. He looked different. This was the first thing she registered, and it was important, because Vaeric had always been one of those men who seemed to maintain a fixed appearance regardless of circumstance. The kind of composure that expressed itself in physical consistency, always upright, always centered, always giving nothing away in the way he occupied space. He looked like he hadn't slept properly in 7 weeks. He was still tall, still carried the specific quality of physical authority that had nothing to do with posture and everything to do with the way he processed the space around him. But beneath the road-worn clothing, beneath the coat he hadn't changed from the ship, there was something that she had not seen in him since the years before his throne had been fully consolidated, a kind of unguarded rawness, as though the control mechanisms that kept him sealed had been running on partial power for long enough that the edges were beginning to show. He stopped when he saw her. For a moment, neither of them said anything. This was the first honest silence they had shared in 7 years, and it had the weight of all the dishonest silences that had preceded it. All the things unsaid, unasked, unacknowledged, the accumulated sediment of a relationship conducted in the margins of a kingdom. "You look well," he said. "Don't," she said. He closed his mouth. "We're not doing that," she said. "Whatever happens in this room, it's not going to start with pleasantries." He nodded once, with the specific quality of a man accepting terms. "All right." "Why are you here, Vaeric?" "I told you in the message." "You told me what you wanted me to believe was your reason," she said. "I'm asking what actually brought you to a coastal runner in winter with 8 men and no fleet." He looked at her for a long moment. This was the Vaeric she had spent years learning, the one who, when confronted with a question that had no strategic answer, went still before he spoke, because he was filtering the honest response through the machinery that had been installed by decades of governing, the machinery that assessed everything for risk before it allowed it to exit. He was fighting that machinery right now. She could see it. "Because I woke up the morning after you left," he said, and found a ring on the floor of the moon chamber. And I stood there looking at it, and I understood, not gradually, not over time, immediately, in the space of looking at it, that I had done something I could not undo. And every decision I made afterward was an attempt to outmaneuver that understanding. The Eastern Army, she said, was panic, he said. The word cost him. She could see the cost of it. A man who had built an entire reign on the premise of never being in a state that could be described as panic, saying the word about himself with the flat, stripped honesty of someone who had run out of more flattering vocabulary. I told myself it was diplomacy, it was leverage, it was strategic positioning. He paused. It was panic. She said nothing. He walked further into the room until he was in the same band of late light as she was, and stopped. He did not close the distance between them further than this, which was something she noted, the instinct to keep the conversation from being about proximity. The marriage stands, he said. I'm not here to ask you to ignore what I did or to pretend it can be reversed. I know what I did. I know the sequence of it and the cost of it. I'm not here to negotiate that. Then what are you here to negotiate? Nothing, he said. She looked at him. I'm here because I owe you an accounting, he said. Not because it changes anything, because it's owed, and because I have spent 7 weeks watching what I built with you unravel in my hands in increments, and he stopped. I finally ran out of the kind of pride that was keeping me from crossing the water. This was the moment she understood something she had been circling for 7 weeks without landing on it directly. The Alpha's relationship with pride is not simple vanity. It is something deeper and more structural. It is the architecture through which he organizes the world, the load-bearing wall of his entire self-construction. Pride, for a man like Vaeric, was not an emotion. It was infrastructure. And the moment it failed to hold weight was not a moment of humility. It was a moment of structural collapse. What she was looking at was the aftermath of that collapse. Not a reformed man. Not yet. Possibly not ever. But a man who had been forced, by 7 weeks of consequence, to inhabit the full cost of his choices without the anesthesia of power to manage the sensation. She had spent 7 years waiting for this to be possible. She had stopped waiting before she reached the mountain pass. I hear you, she said. He waited. I believe you, she said. I believe this is honest, and I believe it costs you, and I believe you mean it. She paused. And it doesn't change what happened, and it doesn't change where I am, and it doesn't change the fact that what was between us, whatever it was, however real, however much of it was exactly what I believed it to be, was not enough to survive what you chose. I know, he said. You can't know that yet, she said. You know it cognitively. You don't know it in the place where you make decisions, because if you did, you wouldn't have crossed the sea to say it in person. You would have written it in a letter and let it be over. He looked at her with the expression she recognized from the war rooms, the expression he wore when he had been outmaneuvered by an argument he couldn't refute. Not anger, not defeat, a kind of forced stillness that was his highest approximation of grace. You're right, he said. I know I'm right, she said. That's not the conversation. Then what is? She looked at him. 7 years, 7 weeks, the ring on the floor and the stone behind the sternum and the mountain pass, and Therion handing her a cup without asking, and Nyeva saying all the versions are true. The conversation, she said, is me telling you that I'm not returning to Valtheris. Not now. Not for a different arrangement, not in any configuration. And I'm asking you to hear that, fully, in the place where you make decisions, and to respect it, and then to go back to your kingdom and be the better king that losing me should have taught you to be. The words landed in the room and stayed there. Vaeric stood in the band of light and absorbed them with the full-body quality of a man absorbing something that was simultaneously expected and devastating. The wound he had known was coming that still had the capacity to surprise him with its depth when it arrived. He said nothing for a long time. Then, is it him? It was not a question. It was the thing beneath the question. The raw, stripped-down thing that had been present since he walked through the doors and had been conducting itself through every exchange with the invisible pressure of the unsaid. Therion, she said. Yes. She looked at him steadily. That's not the right question. It feels like the right question. It feels like it, she said, because it would give you somewhere to put what you're feeling. An opponent, a territory that was taken, something you could frame as competition rather than consequence. She paused. But there is no opponent. There's only the choice you made and the space it left. He looked at her for a long moment, and something shifted in his face. Not acceptance, not quite, but the beginning of the work that would eventually produce acceptance. The preliminary breaking of ground that had to happen before anything could be planted. "He's a good man," he said. It cost him something to say it, and he said it anyway, which was perhaps the most honest thing she had heard from him in 7 years. "Yes," she said. "Better than I was to you. Different than you were to me," she said. "Comparison isn't the point." He closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, they held something she had not seen there before. Not grief exactly, because Vaeric processed grief internally and invisibly, but something adjacent to it, something like the recognition of a life one had been living and had only now turned around to see in full. "I want you to know," he said, "that what I said in the moon chamber, that you were a season, that the Empire required it, I believed it when I said it. And the morning after you left, I understood that believing it didn't make it true. And those are two different failures, and I own both of them." She let his words land. She let them have their full weight. "I know," she said. "I've known you long enough to know the difference between dishonesty and blindness. What you were was blind." "Is there a difference from where you stood?" "From where I stood," she said, "no. But it matters for what you do next." He looked at her with the question. "Blind men can learn to see," she said. "Dishonest men only learn to lie better." He stood with this for a long moment. The light in the room had shifted while they talked. The afternoon bands gone amber and low, the shadows longer and softer, the great hall of Aurelian settling into the particular quiet of early evening. Then the side door opened. Not the main doors. The side door, the one that connected the great hall to the interior corridor that ran behind the council rooms. The one that should have been locked from the inside. The man who came through it was not one of Therian's household. She knew his face. That was the first cold shock of it. The recognition arriving before the sense could catch up. The brain indexing a face in its catalog of known quantities before the significance of the context processed. He was a young man, well-dressed in road clothes, with the kind of deliberate unremarkability of someone who had been trained to pass without registering. She had seen him twice in Valtheris in the past year, once in the outer council corridor, once at a reception in the eastern wing where she had noted him without placing him because he had moved with the practiced invisibility of someone who had not wanted to be placed. He was one of Elisara's people. She understood this in the instant before he spoke, the way the final piece of a pattern completes itself. All the preceding information reorganizing around this new point of recognition with a sudden unpleasant clarity. He was not looking at her. He was looking at Vaeric. "My lord," he said. "Lady Elisara's fleet anchored 2 miles south an hour ago. She requests an immediate meeting." The room went completely still. Vaeric turned towards the man with the specific quality of stillness that Seralya had learned to read as extreme anger at the threshold of action. "How did you get into this keep?" "Lady Elisara made arrangements in advance," the man said. He said it without apology, without performance, with the flat effect of someone executing instructions and not interested in the moral dimensions of doing so. Seralya looked at Vaeric. His jaw was working. The anger in him was the clean, cold variety. Not the hot anger of a man caught off guard, but the specific cold fury of a man who had just understood that he had been followed, that the decision he had made to come here alone had been anticipated and countered, that his gesture of honesty had been made inside a frame he had not built and did not control. "Leave this room," he said to the messenger. He said it in the voice that did not require volume, the voice that had ended careers and begun wars in quieter registers than this. The messenger assessed the room with the calculation of a man deciding between instructions from 2 different sources, and in that calculation Seralya saw the whole architecture of what was happening. Elisara's people inside Aurelian's walls, a fleet 2 miles south, a meeting request that was not a request. This was the machine of a politically brilliant woman who had discovered her new husband crossing the winter sea alone to a coast where his former companion was now resident, and had decided that waiting to see how it resolved was not a risk she intended to take. The messenger left. Seralya looked at Vaeric. "You didn't know," she said. "No," he said. His voice was controlled, but only barely. I knew she had people watching Valtheris's ports. I thought I'd move faster than the intelligence could travel. You moved exactly as fast as she expected you to, Seralya said. This was the brutal truth of it, and they both knew it. Elisara of the Southern Dominion had not become the political force she was by failing to anticipate the moves of the people around her. She had agreed to a marriage alliance with a king she knew was still emotionally entangled elsewhere, and she had agreed to it because she was not a woman who entered arrangements she could not manage. And management, in her vocabulary, meant information, and information meant having people positioned to watch what you needed to watch. She had been watching Vaeric since before the ink was dry on their treaty. The power of the Alpha is real. The fear he generates is real. The dominion he commands is real. But there is a specific vulnerability that lives inside that power like a splinter in wood. The belief that superior force creates superior vision. That being the most powerful presence in a room means being the most informed presence in a room. This conflation has ended more thrones than war. It ends careers. It ends dynasties. Vaeric had moved with the certainty of a man whose reach was long, and he had moved without accounting for the woman beside his throne who had been quietly building a longer reach of her own. The door from the main entrance opened. Therion came in. He took in the room with the single comprehensive glance of a man who had been alerted by his own people to the presence of an unauthorized entry point and an unfamiliar ship in his southern waters, and his face held the controlled expression of a sovereign discovering that his household had been breached by a sequence of events he had not fully anticipated. He looked at Seralya first. She gave him the short, precise nod that said, "I'm all right. I understand what's happening. Hold." He read it correctly. His gaze moved to Vaeric. The two kings looked at each other across the great hall of Aurelian with the complex regard of men who had been sovereign neighbors for years. Not enemies, not allies, not friends, and not strangers, who were now sharing a room with a woman and a situation that had removed most of the usual buffer of diplomatic protocol from the encounter. "King Therion," Vaeric said. "King Vaeric," Therion said. He said it with the complete neutrality of a man who has decided to receive a guest as a guest, until circumstances require otherwise. "I understand your passage was faster than expected." "Apparently not fast enough," Vaeric said. There was a dry, self-directed quality to the statement that was as close to self-deprecation as his register permitted. Therion looked at Seralya. "Lady Elisara's fleet has requested permission to enter the harbor. I've given them the outer anchorage and courtesy messenger access." He paused. "I've also quietly doubled the watch on all interior corridors." "That's the correct response," Seralya said. Vaeric looked at her. "You don't have to manage this." "I'm not managing it," she said. "I'm thinking alongside it." She looked at both of them. "Elisara coming here is not a threat to this coast, and it's not a threat to either of you. It's a statement. She's here because she needs Vaeric to understand that she cannot be moved around the board without consequence. And she needs me to understand that she knows I exist, and she needs both of us to know that she's watching." "She's here because she thinks I'm here to take you back," Vaeric said. "Aren't you?" The question came out quieter than she intended. Not accusatory. Honest. He looked at her. In the flat, fading light of the great hall, with the complicated geography of the last hour visible in his face, Vaeric of Valtheris, the man who had commanded armies and bent rivals and governed an empire for a decade with the unbroken certainty of a man who had never seriously been wrong, looked at her with the answer she had not known she was still waiting for. "I told myself no," he said. "I told myself I came to make peace with what I did, to give you the accounting, to let it be clean." He stopped. "And I don't know. I genuinely don't know whether I believed that when I got on the ship. This honesty, the raw, particular honesty of a man who could not lie to himself under sufficiently direct pressure, was the version of Vaeric she had loved, not the king. The man who, alone in a room with a fire burned low and the empire asleep, would admit that he did not know something. It had always been the rarest version. She felt it cost her something to hear it now. Not regret, not going back, not undoing the stone or the mountain pass or the 31 days, but a specific sharp sadness for the relationship that had existed in the margins of everything, the one that had been real, the one that had not survived the size of what surrounded it. She grieved it, quickly, in the space between one breath and the next. She had learned from a man who stood at a harbor dock that grief could be done in manageable amounts. "I know," she said, "and it doesn't change what I said." A sound from the outer courtyard. Voices. The organized noise of a delegation being received. Elisara's people come through the harbor gate with the efficiency of a woman who moved at her own pace regardless of welcome. Therion looked at the door. "She'll want this hall," he said. "She can have the receiving room," Seralya said. "She doesn't need the hall. She needs an audience with her husband, and she needs to know I'm not a threat to her marriage." She paused. "I'm not. I never was. She needs to hear that from me directly." Vaeric looked at her with an expression she could not entirely read. Somewhere in it was something adjacent to respect, and somewhere beneath that was the particular sadness of a man understanding what he had been given and failed to protect. "You'd speak with her," he said. "Yes." "Why?" "Because she's right to be here," Seralya said, "and because she's a more interesting person than either of you has probably given her credit for, and because the only way this doesn't become a catastrophic misunderstanding that costs 3 kingdoms something unnecessary is if someone in this room is willing to deal with it honestly, and the two of you are constitutionally unable to do that with each other right now." Therion made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Vaeric looked at her for a long moment. "She's going to try to take something from you," he said. "She operates through leverage. She'll have found something." This was the warning. She heard it as the thing it was. Well, not a threat, not manipulation, but genuine information from a man who knew his wife's methods because he had married them. The warning of someone trying to protect, with the only tool he had left. "Thank you," she said. She meant it. She walked toward the receiving room. Elisara of the Southern Dominion was not what Seralya had expected, though she could not have said precisely what she had expected. Some projection, probably, of her own worst fears dressed in another woman's face. What she found instead was a woman perhaps 5 years younger than herself, with the dark eyes and composed mouth of someone who had been politically educated since childhood and wore that education as a second skeleton. She was not beautiful in the soft way. She was beautiful in the structural way, the way architecture is beautiful, in the correctness of proportions designed to hold weight. She was standing at the far end of the receiving room when Seralya entered, and she turned with the controlled movement of a woman who had known the door was going to open and had decided how she would be standing when it did. She looked at Seralya. Seralya looked back. "You're smaller than I expected," Elisra said. "People usually expect something larger," Seralya said. "The legend expands." "In this case, the legend is the woman who left the most powerful king in the known world with nothing but a ring on his floor," Elisra said. "That tends to resize itself in the imagination." Seralya came further into the room. She did not sit. Neither did Elisra. The space between them had the quality of a conversation that understood its own stakes. "Why are you here?" Seralya said. "Because my husband crossed the sea in a coastal runner in winter," Elisara said, "which is the action of either a man on a military objective or a man who cannot think straight. The fleet was an insurance against the former. Coming myself was insurance against the latter." "He told you he was coming?" "He told me he was going to the summit planning meetings in the north," Elisara said. "I know where he went." "And you followed." "I accompanied," Elisara said, with the precise correction of a woman who understood that the vocabulary of her own position was not incidental. "There is a difference." They looked at each other. Power recognizes power. It is not always comfortable. This recognition can manifest as threat, or as respect, or as both simultaneously. But it has a specific texture, a quality of attention that ordinary social exchange doesn't carry. They were taking each other's measure with the seriousness of two people who understood what they were measuring. "I'm not your enemy," Seralya said. "You were his," Elisar said, "for 7 years, whether he knew it or not by intention, by position." Her voice was careful and hard in the way of very controlled things. "You were the thing in his life that he valued without knowing how to keep. That made you the standard against which everything else was measured and found insufficient, including me." "That's not," Seralya started. "I know it wasn't deliberate," Elisar said. "That's what makes it worse, not better." She moved one step forward. Her composure was perfect, and under it was something that Seralya recognized as the specific pain of a brilliant woman who had accepted an arrangement with clear eyes and still found the reality of it harder than the analysis had predicted. I married him for the alliance. I am not naive about the transactional nature of what we built, but I am also a person. And the person I am has spent 3 months in a marriage where I am constantly measured against a ghost who is not dead and not gone, and is now standing inside the walls of a coast I can see from my fleet. So, the room held this. Seralya felt the weight of it, the complete weight. Not guilt, she had done nothing that required guilt, but the specific human recognition of collateral damage. The way good decisions made by one person could still land on another person as damage. Not because anyone intended it, but because the geometry of competing lives did not always accommodate clean angles. "What do you want from me?" Seralya said. Elisara looked at her for a long moment. "Nothing that's yours to give," she said. "What I want is for my husband to stop being a man who is permanently in the process of mourning the person he should have held on to. What I want is for the marriage I made to become the marriage I expected to make." She paused. The composure held, but the edge beneath it was audible. "What I need is for you to be gone. Not dead, not erased, simply out of the radius of his attention, permanently and irrevocably." Seralya held her gaze. She understood the request. She understood the human need behind it. She understood, with a complete analytical clarity that was both her gift and sometimes her curse, that Elisara was not wrong about any of the mechanics she had described. The ghost in a marriage was always the most powerful person in it, because the ghost did not have to show up to compete. She also understood in the same breath what Elisara was not saying, the part she was omitting, the piece that Vaeric had told her to watch for. "You said you have nothing to leverage," Seralya said slowly. Elisara's expression shifted a fraction. "Not much. Enough." "My intelligence in Valtheris covers a great deal of ground," Elisara said, "including the private correspondence files that Vaeric kept for 7 years in the Eastern Archive." There it was. Seralya stood very still. The correspondence files. 7 years of private letters, her analysis, her assessments, her actual unfiltered political thinking that she had conducted in writing because writing helped her think, and she had trusted that the Eastern Archive was sealed. Strategic documents. Advisory letters that contained things that could be described, in the wrong political context and with the wrong framing, as the private influence of an unofficial power over a sovereign's decision-making. In Elisara's hands, framed correctly, distributed to Valtheris' Council of Nobles, and the Southern Coalition and the Eastern Border Lords who were already nervous about stability, those letters could be positioned as evidence of an unauthorized political operative working inside the imperial court, not a trusted advisor, not a sovereign partner, something that had no official sanction and therefore no legal protection. The specific genius of the leverage was that it did not require the letters to be false. They were real. Everything in them was real and true, and represented 7 years of genuine work in service of an empire that had never given her a formal title to do it. The truth, in the wrong hands, was the best leverage there was. She looked at Elisara and understood, with cold precision, that she was looking at a woman who was not cruel but was absolutely capable, a woman who had come here not to destroy her but to show her the shape of the blade and explain quietly that the blade did not have to be used. She was at the wall. Every direction that had been available to her since the moon chamber, the mountain pass, the coastal road, the 31 days, the correspondence she had sent to Vaeric, the conversation she had just finished with him in the hall, all of it had led here, to this room, to this woman, to the specific compressed moment where every path forward required her to change the shape of something fundamental in herself. She could fight it. She had the intelligence and the will. She could work the situation. She could also look at it clearly and understand that this was not a situation to be worked. This was a situation to be transformed. And transformation required something she had not yet, in all the weeks since the moon chamber, fully allowed herself to commit to. She had left Valtheris. She had arrived at Aurelian. Therion had asked her, on the coastal wall, "Have you arrived?" She had not answered. She looked at Elisara across the receiving room of Aurelian Keep, with the winter sea somewhere outside the walls and Vaeric in the hall behind her, and Therion in the war room not far, and Nyeva somewhere in the east wing with her books, and the morning light that had been cold enough since her mother died. And she felt with the full-body clarity of a decision made not by calculation, but by something deeper and less reversible than calculation, that she was done being the ghost in anyone else's story. What came next was going to cost her something, possibly everything she had built in 7 years, possibly the safety of the last 7 weeks. The blade was real, and the woman holding it was capable, and the situation was about as cornered as a situation got. And still, she met Elisara's eyes and said, in a voice that was calm and final as closed stone, "I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to understand that I'm telling you because I want to, not because of what you're holding. What you're holding doesn't change what I'm about to say, but what I'm about to say changes everything." Elisara waited. Seralya took one breath. "I want you to witness something," she said. "Today. Now. In front of both kings and whoever else needs to be present." "Witness what?" She looked at Elisara with the full measure of 7 years and 7 weeks in one mountain pass and 31 days, and a girl who said all the versions are true, and a man who handed her a cup without asking, and a stone behind her sternum that had shifted sometime in the last hour into something she was only just beginning to identify as the weight of the person she was deciding to become. "The end of the ghost," she said, "and the beginning of something that doesn't live in anyone else's story." Elisara did not move immediately. This was the first thing Seralya noted, that the woman who had arrived with a fleet and a blade of leverage and the composed certainty of someone executing a prepared plan was now standing in the receiving room of Aurelian Keep with the specific stillness of someone whose prepared plan had just encountered a variable it had not fully modeled. Not fear, not retreat. Recalculation. She was fast. Seralya would give her that. "The end of the ghost," Elisara repeated. Her voice was precise. She was buying herself the 2 seconds that repetition affords. "And what does that look like exactly?" "It looks like me standing in front of both kings and your people and anyone else who needs to be present," Seralya said, "and making a formal witness declaration that I hold no claim, political, personal, or territorial, on Valtheris, on its king, or on any arrangement connected to either. Unambiguous, undeniable, documented if you want it documented." Elisara looked at her with the expression of a woman deciding whether to trust an unexpected gift or examine it for concealed weight. "And the correspondence files. Keep them," Seralya said. "They show 7 years of a woman doing the work of governing an empire she was never formally credited for. I'm not ashamed of a single line in them." She paused. "But they become irrelevant if I've already publicly removed myself from the equation. You can't threaten someone with evidence of influence they've already renounced." The calculation in Elisara's eyes ran its course. "Why?" she said. "Why would you do this?" "Because I'm not a ghost," Seralya said, "and I'm done letting other people's fear of me define the shape of my life." She held Elisara's gaze with the directness she had spent 7 years deploying only in private. "And because you are not wrong. You are in a marriage with a man who is still looking backward. That is real damage, and you did not cause it, and you deserve better than inheriting it." Elisara was quiet for a moment. "You don't like me," she said. "I don't know you," Seralya said. "I know your methods. I know your intelligence. I know you followed your husband across the winter sea with a fleet because you understood the stakes clearly enough to act on them." She paused. "I respect all of that. Liking is a different matter, and it requires time we don't have right now." Something moved in Elisara's face. Not warmth, but the structural precursor to something that might eventually become respect of its own variety. The acknowledgement of a mind recognizing an equal. "You're giving up considerable ground," she said. "I'm clarifying ground that was never legally mine," Seralya said. "There's a difference." "And Therian." The name landed between them with the specific weight of the unsaid. Seralya did not flinch from it. "Is his own sovereign making his own decisions?" she said. "Nothing I declare today speaks for him." "And yet you're standing in his keep." "I am," Seralya said, "and I'll be standing in it after today, and after your fleet leaves, and after your husband sails back to Valtheris." She let the statement hold its full weight. "That is not a ghost. That is a person living her own life in a place she chose. If you can accept the difference, we can both leave this room with something useful." The receiving room held the exchange in its stone walls the way it held heat. Slowly, reluctantly, without full release. Then Elisara nodded once. precise, unadorned. "Assemble your witness," she said. They returned to the great hall together, not in alliance, not in warmth, but in the specific functional accord of two competent people who had identified the geometry of a workable outcome and were willing to execute it. Seralya entered first. Vaeric was standing near the center of the room where she had left him, and she saw in the way his attention shifted when she came through the door that he had been listening for her footsteps in the corridor and had found the interval difficult. He looked at Elisara behind her. Something crossed his face, not guilt, which he was constitutionally incapable of displaying in company, but a form of the thing that lives near guilt in a man who has too much discipline for the full expression. An accounting. Elisara met his eyes with the composed directness of a woman who had already made her decisions and was not interested in relitigating the sequence of events that had brought them here. She looked at him the way very capable people look at situations that have been managed, with the forward attention of someone whose concern is now the next thing and not the last. "You should send for Therion," Vaeric said to Seralya. Not a command, a suggestion, which from him was a form of concession. "Dorith," Seralya said. Dorith materialized from the corridor with the efficiency of a woman who had been adjacent to the situation for the past hour and was prepared for any reasonable request. She went without being told twice. They waited in the great hall, the four of them, in the spaces of the room that expressed the distance between them without requiring it to be stated. Vaeric, on the west side with the posture of a man who had stopped performing ease. Elisara near the door she had entered, standing with the stillness of someone for whom waiting was a tactical position. Seralya in the center, which was where she had stood at the beginning of the day, and which felt now less like neutrality and more like the only accurate place to occupy. Therion came in from the eastern corridor with Kair and two of his commanders at a distance behind him, not because she had asked for witnesses beyond himself, but because in a coastal kingdom where a foreign fleet was anchored 2 miles south and 2 foreign kings were in the Great Hall simultaneously, the senior council had apparently decided that proximity was prudent. He looked at the room, he looked at Seralya. She gave him the nod that meant, "This is about to become something. Stay present." He gave her back the nod that said, "I'm here." She spoke. She had composed it in the 30 seconds between leaving the receiving room and entering this one, which was the kind of compression she was capable of when the thinking had already been done, and what remained was only expression. She spoke plainly and without decoration, and said every word she had said she would say in front of Elisara. The declaration, the renunciation of claim, the formal public acknowledgement that Valtheris and its king and all political arrangements connected to either were concluded as far as she was concerned. And she said it in the voice she used when she meant something to be heard as final, which was the same voice she used for everything else, because she had learned long ago that the voice that means to be believed was not a different register from ordinary speech, but simply ordinary speech with nothing withheld. When she finished, the room was quiet. Vaeric looked at her across the stone floor of the great hall with an expression she recognized and had not expected to see from this direction. The expression he wore when he lost an argument and knew it and was deciding, with the full machinery of his enormous capability for adaptation, what to do next. He was reconfiguring. She could see it happening in real time. The Vaeric who had crossed the sea in a coastal runner to reclaim something was already giving way, in the architecture of his thinking, to the Vaeric who had heard the argument and was beginning to understand that this was not a loss to be countered, but a lesson to be carried. He was not done yet, not by a considerable distance, but the machinery was running in the right direction for the first time since the moon chamber. "Witnessed," Therion said. His voice was even and formal, and his eyes were on Seralya with the quality she had come to recognize as his fullest attention. Not the polite attention of courtesy, but the complete attention of someone investing the entirety of their focus in a single point. "Witnessed," said Kair, with the flat authority of a woman for whom official declarations were a normal business function. "Witnessed," Elisara said, and then, with the precise economy of a woman who had come here for a specific outcome and obtained it, "We will leave by evening tide." She looked at Vaeric. He looked at her. The exchange between them was private in the way that marriages are always ultimately private. Whatever was in it belonged to them, and the room understood this and did not reach toward it. Vaeric looked at Seralya one last time. He did not speak. What he had to say had already been said in the hall, in the 4 sentences of his letter, in the 7 years before the moon chamber, in the ring on the cold floor, in the coastal runner crossing winter sea. He had said everything. What remained was the silence that follows everything, which was the only honest thing left between them. She nodded once. He nodded back. He walked toward the main doors where Elisara was already moving, with the contained stride of a man who had made his decision and was executing it before the secondary thinking could interfere with the primary. The doors closed. The great hall of Aurelian was suddenly much quieter. Caer looked at Seralya with the raised eyebrow she apparently deployed as a universal response to most of what the world produced. "Efficient," she said, and followed the commanders out through the east corridor. Therion stood in the room. Seralya stood in the room. The late light came through the high windows in the long, amber, final quality of a winter afternoon that had burned through everything it had to offer and was now simply present in its last minutes before dark. She felt the stone that had lived behind her sternum since the moon chamber. She felt it differently, not gone. It would not be gone immediately, and she had learned enough in the past weeks to not expect resolution as a single event rather than a long sequence of smaller events. But it had changed shape. Less dense, less pressing. The weight of something that had been carried correctly for long enough that the body had begun to accommodate it rather than resist it. She looked at Therion. He was looking at her with the complete, unperformed attention that she had been unable to categorize when she first encountered it and could now name without difficulty. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know," she said. "You did it anyway." "Yes." "Was it for her?" he said, "or for yourself?" She thought about this with the honesty it deserved, because it deserved it, and because he was the kind of person who would know if she shaded it. "Both," she said, "in different proportions." He nodded. "Have you arrived?" he said. The same question. The coastal wall, the winter sea, the question she had not answered before the harbor bell interrupted it. She stood in the great hall of Aurelian Keep, this place that moved and breathed like something living, that held its ground on rock jutting into the sapphire sea, that had never asked her for anything she hadn't chosen to give. And she felt the full complexity of the answer the way you feel the full complexity of anything true. Multiple things simultaneously, none of them canceling the others. She had loved Vaeric, and she still carried the residue of that love, in the way that all real things leave residue, and she was not going to pretend otherwise. She had survived the moon chamber and the mountain pass, and 31 days and the receiving room and the public declaration in this hall. She had a stone behind her sternum that was changing shape. She had a girl in the East Wing who said the morning light had been cold enough since her mother died. She had a man standing in front of her who asked honest questions and waited for honest answers. "Yes," she said. What happened next did not announce itself. The shouting from the outer courtyard arrived first, not the organized call of the watch announcing visitors, but the disordered noise of something happening faster than ceremony could manage. Then the sound of boots on stone in the eastern corridor, multiple sets, moving at the controlled, urgent pace of soldiers who had been told to contain rather than respond. Therion was already moving toward the door before the first runner came through it. The runner was one of his harbor watch, young, out of breath, with the expression of someone carrying information too large for their face to hold steady. "My lord," he said, "the southern fleet." "Elisara's ships are departing," Therion said. "I gave them evening tide." "Not departing, my lord." The runner swallowed. "Reforming. They've moved from the outer anchorage, and they're blocking the harbor mouth." The room went completely still. Therion looked at the runner with the expression that replaced his ordinary composure when the stakes crossed a specific threshold. Not anger, not alarm, but the absolute focused cold of a man whose coast had just been threatened and who had spent 3 wars learning exactly what to do with that information. "My fleet," he said. "The northern squadron is at sea, my lord. The southern and eastern are in harbor." He paused. "The eastern squadron is in the inner berths. If the harbor mouth is blocked—" "They're not going anywhere," Therion said. Seralya understood the geometry of it in the same second he did. 2 of Therion's 3 naval squadrons were inside a harbor whose mouth was now controlled by Elisara's fleet. The one squadron at sea was the one he had quietly mobilized 2 days ago, positioned to be visible, not to engage. Not positioned for this. This was not Elisara consolidating a political outcome. This was someone else's move being made through Elisara's ships. Vaeric, Seralya said. Therion looked at her. Not him, she said, already revising as she spoke, working through it at speed. He didn't know. He came alone. He dissolved the Eastern Army. This isn't him. She stopped. Who is the senior commander of Elisara's fleet? The runner looked uncertain. Find out, Therion said. The runner left. Seralya was already moving through the logic. The Eastern Army had been dissolved. Vaeric had said it in his letter, and she believed him, because the specific honesty of those 4 sentences was not the honesty of a man who lied in his private hand. But dissolved did not mean disbanded. Soldiers whose orders had been rescinded returned to their commanders, and commanders who had standing orders from other sources, from Elisara's political network, from the coalition of nobles who had backed the Southern Alliance and had a great deal invested in its stability. Those commanders did not necessarily wait for a new authorization before they acted on the last authorization they had. Someone in Elisara's circle, not Elisara herself, or she would not have agreed to the declaration in the receiving room, would not have accepted the witnessed renunciation, had decided that the outcome of this day was not the outcome they had been managing for. The Southern Alliance had more stakeholders than its principals, and some of those stakeholders had decided to act. How many ships, Therion said to Dorith, who had appeared in the doorway with the information before being asked. 14 at the harbor mouth, she said. Another 8 still anchored at the outer position. My eastern squadron. 12 ships in the inner berths, 4 functional for immediate departure. She paused. Against 14 at the mouth. Not good arithmetic. Not impossible arithmetic, but not good, particularly in Winter Harbor conditions where the narrowness of the mouth limited the engagement geometry and the advantage went to the blocking force. Seralya looked at Therion. He was already making decisions. She could see the sequence of them moving behind his face with the speed of a man who had done this before and whose body remembered what to do even when the specifics were new. Get the Eastern Squadron to readiness, he said to Dorith. Don't move them yet. Make sure they can move. Dorith was already gone. He looked at Seralya. Where are Vaeric and Elisara right now? On their way to the docks, she said. They were moving when we came in here. If they reach those ships before we reach them, they don't know, she said. Elisara agreed in the receiving room in good faith. This is not her play. Then whose? She looked at him. She knew whose. She had known it for the 30 seconds since the harbor report arrived, and had been working through the confirmation in the time since. There was one person in the geometry of this situation who had the motivation, the access, and the specific kind of desperation that produced military action as a first resort rather than a last one. One person for whom the declaration in the Great Hall had represented not a resolution, but an irreversible closing of options. One person who had backed the Southern Alliance not for its stated purposes, but for the control it represented, and who had watched that control dissolve in the course of a single afternoon in a coastal keep. The Eastern Border commanders who had defected from Vaeric in the weeks after her departure, the ones who had challenged his authority during the period when his obsession had made him visible and vulnerable. 3 of them had returned to their posts when Vaeric stabilized. 1 had not. Lord Commander Edrin of the 4th Eastern Division, who had spent 20 years in Valtheris' military structure accumulating power at the intersection of Valtheris and the Southern Coalition's interests, who had a great deal more to lose from a stable Vaeric and a politically resolved situation than from a war, who had apparently decided somewhere in the past several hours that the harbor mouth of Aurelian was worth the gamble. Edrin, she said. Therion said nothing for a moment. Then, you're certain? The 4th Eastern Division had maritime assets through the coalition agreements, she said. 14 ships at a harbor mouth is a blocking action, not an invasion. It's leverage. He's trying to force a negotiation that doesn't happen inside these walls. What does he want? Chaos, she said. Specifically, the kind of chaos that reopens the questions that got closed today. If Vaeric's ships and Elisara's fleet and Therion's coast are all pointed at each other in a winter harbor, the agreements made in a receiving room become irrelevant. Everything goes back to the beginning. And I'm the target. You're the location, she said. The target is the resolution. This was the thing about power that its holders rarely fully absorbed until it was demonstrated to them with force. Power did not require active enemies. It generated them passively, simply by existing at scale. Every agreement made, every alliance consolidated, every question resolved created a corresponding set of people for whom the resolution was a loss. The more comprehensive the resolution, the more people it threatened. This was not cynicism. This was the arithmetic of political ecosystems. Therion had taken in a political refugee from the most powerful throne in the known world, and 31 days later his harbor was blocked by 14 ships controlled by a man who had calculated that stability was more dangerous to him than conflict. This was the cost of choosing correctly. This was the specific concrete form that cost took when you made it. "I need to get to the docks," she said. He looked at her. "Vaeric and Elisara don't know what's happening," she said. "If they walk into those ships without understanding that Edrin has taken control of the fleet, they are either hostages or leverage depending on what he needs in the next hour." She paused. "I know Edrin. I've sat across tables from him. I know how he reads situations and I know what he responds to." "You're not," Therion started. "I'm not going to get on a ship," she said. "I'm going to the dock. There's a difference." He looked at her with the expression that had replaced all his other expressions, the complete, present, honest attention of a man who understood the full situation and was not going to pretend he had no stake in the outcome. "2 of my guards," he said. "At your flanks, non-negotiable." "2," she agreed. She moved toward the eastern corridor. "Seralya." She stopped. He crossed the room to her in 4 steps with the direct, purposeful movement of a man who had decided something and was executing it before the moment closed. He stopped in front of her at the distance that was neither public nor private, the distance of complete honesty. He put his hand against the side of her face. She stayed completely still. "Come back from the dock," he said. It was not a command. It was the specific, unguarded statement of a man who had been at this business long enough to know that the things you didn't say were the things you regretted most. She looked at him with everything she had, 7 years and 7 weeks, and the stone that was changing shape, and the mountain pass, and the morning light, and the girl in the library, and the harbor bell, and the declaration in the great hall, and the full complicated human weight of every version of herself that had led to this specific moment on this specific stone floor. "I will," she said. She walked. The eastern corridor was 30 steps. The outer courtyard was 20 more. The dock road was 140 downhill to the harbor, and she ran it with 2 of Therion's guards flanking her and the winter evening coming down hard over the coast, the last of the light going copper and thin over the sea that held, in its outer anchorage, 8 ships still in position and 14 more arranged in the harbor mouth, with the patient geometry of a military maneuver executed by someone who had spent 20 years learning patience as a weapon. She could see the dock ahead. She could see Vaeric and Elisara, still 50 meters from the water, slowing as the shapes of the blocking formation resolved into comprehension. She could see, on the deck of the lead ship at the harbor mouth, the figure of a man in military colors who was watching the dock with the still, assessing attention of someone waiting to see which piece moved first. Edrin. She was 60 meters away. 40. The wind came off the water with the hard cold of winter sea, cutting through her coat and the last warmth of the keep behind her, and the 31 days of level ground and the declaration in the great hall, and the hand against her face, and the 2 words that were the most honest words she had received in 7 years. She hit the dock boards at a run. Vaeric turned. His face when he saw her running, saw the guards, processed the harbor in the same second and understood what he was looking at, compressed through surprise and comprehension and something else, something raw and immediate, in the span of 2 seconds. "It's Edrin," she said, not stopping until she was beside him. Her breath was hard from the run. "He's taken operational control of the fleet. He wants the agreements undone." Vaeric looked at the harbor mouth, his jaw set. "How long has he—" "Long enough to have a plan," she said. "Not long enough to have a good one. This is a reactive move. He's out ahead of his intelligence." Elisara was looking at the ships with the cold, focused expression of a woman calculating what her own assets could do against 14 blocking ships, and the answer not satisfying her. "How many men on those decks? Standard complement for a blocking action. He's not here to fight, he's here to freeze the situation," Seralya said. "He needs a conversation." "He's going to get one," Vaeric said, and the temperature of his voice had dropped to the specific register she recognized as the register of a man for whom patience had concluded, and what remained was simple, direct action. He took a step toward the water. She caught his arm. He stopped. He looked at her hand on his arm, then at her face. "Not that kind of conversation," she said. "If you go to that dock as a king demanding compliance, you give him exactly what he needs. An adversarial confrontation that becomes a story he controls. He doesn't need to win. He needs the situation to destabilize." She held his gaze with the complete intensity she had never been permitted to fully deploy in his presence. "Let me go." "You," he said. "He doesn't know what happened in the keep today," she said. "He doesn't know about the declaration. He moved too early. He's operating on the intelligence he had before the receiving room." She paused. "Which means he still thinks I'm the lever. Which means I'm the one who can walk out to that dock and show him the lever doesn't exist." Vaeric looked at her. This was the moment. She could see it in him, the exact architecture of the decision forming and the resistance to it, and the intelligence that understood the resistance was wrong, where he had to choose between the instinct of a king who resolved situations with force and the knowledge of a man who understood that some situations could only be resolved by the person who was willing to walk into them empty-handed. He had come across the Winter Sea in a coastal runner with 8 men and no fleet. He understood this, at least. He released her arm. She turned to face the harbor. 14 ships in the mouth, the lead ship 60 meters out on still, cold water. Idryn on the deck with the patience of a military man who had arrived before the other pieces and was content to wait for the board to arrange itself. The dock boards under her feet, the guards at the top of the dock behind her, Vaeric and Elisara at her back. Therion somewhere at the top of the road, watching from the keep wall, the water black and cold and moving. She walked to the end of the dock. She stood in the last of the winter light. No armor, no insignia, no title, no claim. Nothing left to renounce because she had renounced it all already in a great hall on level ground. And she looked at the ship and the man on its deck, and she lifted her voice across 60 meters of winter harbor. "Idryn." Her voice carried the way voices carry over water, cleanly, without distortion, with the specific clarity of the cold. The figure on the deck turned. She could not see his face at this distance. She did not need to. "I have something to tell you," she said. "And when I'm done, I think you're going to understand that there is nothing left here worth the price of what you're holding." The harbor held its breath. The ships held their position. The water moved. And Seralya, of no throne and no title and no season, standing at the end of a dock in the last light of a winter evening with everything she had stripped down to its essential and irreducible form, waited for the silence to decide which direction the world was going to fall. The harbor held its silence for 3 full seconds after her voice crossed the water. 3 seconds is not a long time in most contexts. In the context of a harbor mouth blocked by 14 warships, with 2 foreign kings standing on the dock behind the woman who had just called out the man commanding them, 3 seconds is the specific interval between a situation that can still be shaped and a situation that has already decided what it is. Idryn understood this. She knew he understood it because she had watched him operate in rooms where seconds carried this kind of weight, and she knew his tells. The slight forward lean when he was recalibrating, the way his hand moved to his belt, not toward a weapon, but to the empty space beside it, the gesture of a military man whose body reached for authority when his mind needed a moment to reassemble itself. She watched him lean forward. She waited. "Lady Seralya," he called back across the water. His voice was controlled, professionally projected, the voice of a man who had given commands in weather worse than this. "You're standing on a private dock." "I'm standing on Therion's dock," she said, "which you're welcome to visit when you come through the harbor mouth, which requires moving 14 ships. That's going to take some discussion. That's what I'm here for." A pause. He was calculating. She could feel the calculation from 60 meters away, the same way you feel a change in air pressure, not visible, but present, a shift in the quality of the atmosphere. "Come to the ship," he said. "No," she said. Silence. "Send a boat," he said. "No," she said again. "You're going to hear what I have to say from where I'm standing, and then you're going to make a decision, and the decision you make in the next 10 minutes is going to determine whether you spend the rest of your career as a man who escalated a private matter into an international incident, or a man who assessed a situation correctly and chose the option that didn't require a war. The water moved between them with the patient indifference of water. This was the thing about men who operated through leverage. The whole architecture of the method depended on the other party believing the lever existed. Remove the lever, and what remained was just a man with ships in a harbor he didn't own, a long way from home, in winter, with an increasingly problematic explanation for why he was there. She told him what had happened in the receiving room. She told him about the declaration and the witnesses. She told him about the renunciation of claim, documented and heard by 2 kings and a senior council. She told him, in the plain, direct language she used for things that needed to be understood without embellishment, that the correspondence files Elisara's people held were now irrelevant because the person they pertained to had already publicly removed herself from the equation they were meant to destabilize. She told him that the lever was gone. She told him it had been gone for the past hour. And then she told him the part she had been building to, the part that she understood would land differently from everything that preceded it, because it was the part that addressed not the situation, but the man. "You're not here for Elisara," she said. "You're not here for Valtheris. You're here because the stability you've been watching build for the past month looks like the end of your particular arrangement of influence, and you made a decision to interrupt it before it consolidated." She paused, letting the water carry it. "And I understand that. I understand the mechanics of it, but I want you to understand something in return." She let the pause hold for exactly the right length. "The arrangement you're trying to protect doesn't exist anymore," she said. "Not because of today. Because of the choices that led to today. Choices made by men with more power than judgment. The board you've been playing on has been rebuilt, and the position you're holding in this harbor is a position on the old board." Edrin stood on the deck of his lead ship with the stillness of a man receiving accurate information he had not wanted to receive. The thing about accurate information is that it does not require belief to be effective. It requires only recognition. And she could see, even at 60 meters, in the quality of his stillness, that he was recognizing. She had one more thing to say. "You have a choice right now that you will not have in an hour," she said. "Move the ships, come to the keep, and sit at a table where the new board is being built. Or hold this harbor mouth and become the reason that 3 kingdoms spend the next 5 years explaining to their populations why there was a war over a personal matter that had already been resolved." She looked directly at him across the water. "I have sat in enough rooms to know which of those choices a man with your intelligence makes." Chance. The harbor held everything it had been holding. The blocked mouth, the winter light, the cold water. The 2 foreign kings at the top of the dock. The keep on the hill behind them where a man was watching from the wall. Edrin stood on his deck for a long time. Then he turned and said something to the officer beside him. The lead ship began to move, not toward the dock, sideways, opening the harbor mouth with the slow, deliberate movement of a large vessel that knew its own weight and was not going to be rushed. One by one, in the organized sequence of a fleet that had been given a clear order and was executing it, the other 13 ships followed. The harbor mouth opened. Seralya stood at the end of the dock and watched it happen, and felt something in her chest that was not triumph. Triumph was too simple, too loud, too much the wrong shape for what the moment actually contained. What she felt was closer to relief, but beneath that was something older and quieter. The feeling of a long tension releasing in the specific way of things that have been held under sustained pressure and are finally, provisionally, allowed to rest. She heard footsteps on the dock behind her. Vaeric came to stand beside her. He stood there without speaking for a moment, watching the ships clear the mouth. In the fading winter light, his face had the quality it acquired in the aftermath of significant events. Stripped of the royal surface, just the man underneath, who was more complicated and more human than the king and always had been. "You knew he'd move," he said. "I knew the lever was gone," she said. "The rest was just saying it out loud." He was quiet for a moment. "You did that for this coast." "I did that because it was the right thing to do," she said. "Don't assign it to any one person." He looked at her with the expression she had seen in the great hall, the one adjacent to something he didn't have a clean name for, the one that lived in the space between loss and education. "I'm going to be a better king," he said. It was not a promise directed at her. It was a statement made to the air, to the water, to whatever part of himself was listening. "Not for you, because I finally understand what I was doing wrong." "I know," she said. The council reforms I kept delaying, he said. The governing structure you recommended in the second year, the distributed authority model. Implement it, she said. Elisara will support it. She's politically brilliant and she understands coalition governance better than you do. Use that. He looked at her. Stop being threatened by capable people beside your throne, she said. That's the whole lesson. That's everything. He was quiet for a long time. Then, I loved you. I know, she said. I loved you too. Both of those things are true, and neither of them changes anything that happened or anything that's going to happen, and that's all right. Love isn't invalidated by the inability to survive the conditions around it. It just was what it was. He nodded once, the slow nod of a man integrating something at the level where real change happens. Not the surface, not the performance of understanding, but the structural level where the load-bearing parts of a person are rearranged by contact with a truth that couldn't be outmaneuvered. All right, he said. He walked back up the dock. She stayed at the end of it for a moment longer, alone with the water and the winter evening and the opened harbor mouth, and the long, complicated day folding itself into the past where it would live from now on, permanent and done. Then she walked back too. Elisara was waiting at the top of the dock. Not for Vaeric. She had moved slightly to the side towards Seralya's approach, with the deliberate positioning of a woman who had something specific to say and had decided to say it without an audience. They stood facing each other in the dim end of the afternoon. That was well done, Elisara said. It was necessary, Seralya said. Those aren't mutually exclusive. She paused. The composed face held its composure, but beneath it something had shifted during the past hour. The specific shift of a person who arrived at a place expecting an adversary and found something more complicated and less manageable. I want to say something to you. Say it. What I threatened in the receiving room, Elisara said. The correspondence files. I want you to know that using them was never... She stopped. The precise vocabulary faltered for a moment in a way that was unusually human for a woman whose vocabulary was usually architecturally sound. It was a position. It wasn't a certainty. I know, Seralya said. You knew at the time. Yes. And you offered the declaration anyway. Yes. Elisara looked at her with the expression of a woman who had been prepared for a wide range of responses to this conversation and had not prepared for this one. Why? Because the declaration was the right thing independent of the threat, Seralya said, and because the only way to dismantle leverage is to remove the thing it's leveraged against, not to negotiate around it, not to counter it. She paused. And because I think you're going to be a significant political force for a long time, and I would rather have conducted myself in a way that you can respect than in a way that required me to be smaller than I am. Elisara looked at her for a long moment. You would have made a remarkable queen, she said. I'm going to make a remarkable whatever I am now, Seralya said. Queen was someone else's word for me. I'm still finding my own. Something moved in Elisara's face. Genuine, small, surprising. Not quite a smile. The structural possibility of one. If you ever want to compare notes on the particular challenges of governing beside a man who learned everything the hard way, she said, I'm not difficult to reach. Noted, Seralya said. They did not embrace. They did not perform warmth that wasn't fully there yet. They looked at each other with the honest regard of two people who had met in the worst possible conditions and found in each other something they hadn't expected, and left it at that, which was more than enough, and considerably more than either of them had arrived hoping for. Elisara walked to her husband. Seralya watched them go, the two figures moving together toward the outer harbor, where the fleet was now repositioned, the political alliance that had cost everything walking itself toward the ship that would carry it back to where it had to function, and she felt the full complexity of the moment without trying to simplify it. Both of those things could be true. Loss and its education, grief and its residue, the version that was real and the version that survived, all of them true. She turned and found Therion coming down the dock road. He had come down from the keep when the ships began to move. She had seen him from the dock, the gray-coated figure descending at the measured pace of a man who was not running because the situation no longer required running. And she had felt his presence at the top of the hill the same way she had felt it since the mountain pass, as a constant, reliable weight in the space around her, the kind of weight that was not burden, but ballast. He stopped in front of her. He looked at her face with the complete attention he brought to everything. "The ships moved," he said. "They did." "How?" "I told him the truth," she said, clearly and completely, and without leaving him a way to argue with it. He nodded slowly. "Idrin will be a problem later." "Idrin will come to the table later," she said, "because men who read situations correctly make better long-term decisions than men who don't. And he read this one correctly when given the full information." She paused. "He's going to need a reason to stay at the table. That's a problem for when he arrives, not today." "You're already thinking about after today." "I'm always thinking about after," she said. "That's what I do." He looked at her with the warmth that was not performed, that had never been performed, that had been present from the moment he handed her a cup in a mountain pass and asked nothing for it. "Come back to the keep," he said. She looked at the harbor, the ship's reposition, the mouth open, the winter sea beyond it moving in the long, slow rhythm it had maintained through every human event that had ever occurred on this coast, indifferent and reliable and vast. She looked at it the way she had looked at the horizon from Valtheris's palace windows, but this time with different eyes. Not the eyes of a woman watching a door she hadn't opened yet, the eyes of a woman who had walked through it. She turned. They walked up from the harbor together. The keep received them the way it received everything, with the solid, unhurried permanence of stone that had been in place for generations and expected to remain in place for generations more. The courtyard torches were lit against the falling dark. The smell of the harbor gave way to the smell of the keep's kitchens, warm bread and wood smoke and the sea salt that lived in every stone of the building and would not be cleaned out by anything short of tearing it down. Naeva was in the inner courtyard. She was standing where she had stood on the first day, at the edge of the colonnade with a book she wasn't reading, and she looked at them coming through the gate with the gray eyes that held the direct, cataloging attention she applied to everything she considered significant. She looked at Seralya. "I heard the harbor bell," she said. "Then I heard shouting from the wall watch. Then everything went quiet." "Everything went quiet because it resolved," Seralya said. "Were you the one who resolved it?" "I had help." Naeva looked at her father briefly, then back at Seralya. "The ships are gone?" "The ships are repositioned," Seralya said. "They're going to leave with the evening tide." Naeva nodded with the specific quality of someone who had been maintaining a controlled state of concern and was now releasing it in the smallest increment that accuracy permitted. Her jaw unclenched a fraction. Her shoulders dropped a degree. She looked at the book in her hands. "I was reading about the naval campaign of the Second Vaerel War," she said. "The harbor blocking strategy at Cape Dural. I was trying to figure out what your options were." Seralya looked at her. "What did you conclude?" "That the blocking force had the position advantage but not the time advantage," Naeva said. "They couldn't stay indefinitely. Winter supply constraints and the Northern Squadron already at sea. I thought if someone could just wait them out." "Waiting was an option," Seralya said, "but it would have cost 2 days and potentially destabilized the diplomatic situation in ways that would have been harder to repair than the harbor blockade itself. So you went to the dock." "So I went to the dock." Naeva was quiet for a moment, looking at the book. Then she looked up and said, with the unguarded honesty that came out of her when she wasn't monitoring it, "I'm glad you came back." Seralya looked at this girl, 14 years old and reading naval strategy by torchlight, while the harbor outside was blocked by a foreign fleet, processing the world through the instrument of her extraordinary mind because it was the best instrument she had, because she had learned that understanding was the form of control available to people who hadn't yet accumulated any other kind. She looked at her and felt something that was not pity and not simple affection, but the specific, layered regard of recognizing a version of yourself at a different stage and wanting to give it something you wished you'd had. "I came back because I said I would," Seralya said. Naeva absorbed this. "People say things." "I know," Seralya said. "I said it anyway." They stood in the courtyard for a moment with the torchlight and the wood smoke and the cold and the harbor quiet below the cliff, and Therion standing slightly behind and to the side in the way of a man who understood when to occupy his own separate space. Then Naeva said, "The morning light will be better tomorrow. The storm system cleared east this afternoon. There should be clear sky by dawn." "Then I'll be up for it," Seralya said. Naeva nodded once. She walked back toward the colonnade with her book and disappeared into the interior corridor, and that was all. No dramatic gesture, no declaration, just the quiet return of a girl to her books, which was the most sovereign exit in the keep. Therion came to stand beside Seralya. "She hasn't mentioned the morning light to anyone," he said, "since her mother died." Seralya said nothing. She let the statement exist at its full size without adding to it, because some things were complete as they stood, and the correct response to completeness was to honor it with silence. They stood in the courtyard until the torches had burned another inch, and the last sound of Elisara's fleet departing the outer harbor reached them across the cliff. The organized noise of ships in motion, getting smaller, and then the steady sound of the winter sea returning to its own rhythm. That night, she sat in the library for a long time after the keep had gone quiet. She sat with the specific quality of presence that had been unavailable to her since before the moon chamber. The quality of someone who was not managing a wound or planning a departure or bracing against the next impact, but simply being in a room that was hers, among books she had been reading, with the East Wing's morning light promised for dawn, and a girl 3 corridors away who had given her that promise with the gravity of a person who understood the weight of what they were offering. She thought about 7 years, not with grief, not with anger, not with the stone behind the sternum that had been her companion since the night she removed a ring from her finger in the moon chamber's cold air. The stone was still there, but it had changed its nature, from obstruction to foundation. The difference between a weight that presses on you and a weight that grounds you is not the weight. It is the relationship you have developed with it through time and honest labor. She thought about what she had learned in the long school of Valtheris and what she was still learning in the shorter, cleaner school of Aurelian. Power. What it actually was versus what it performed itself to be. She had watched it perform dominance, certainty, invulnerability, the whole repertoire of the alpha who believed that the appearance of strength was strength, that the wall that kept feeling out also kept weakness in, that the man who showed nothing could not be wounded by anything. She had watched that performance from close enough to see its seams. Real power was not the absence of wound. Real power was the willingness to be wounded and remain, to absorb the full impact of a consequence and not reach for anesthesia, to look at the version of yourself that made the wrong decision and stay in the room with it long enough to understand not just that the decision was wrong, but why. What in you produced it? What beliefs you were operating from? What blindnesses were so integral to your structure that you couldn't see them without something like a moon chamber to reveal them? This was the hardest thing a powerful person could do, not because it required courage in the usual sense. In the usual sense, Vaeric was the most courageous man she had known, capable of decisions that would have unmade lesser people. It required a different kind of courage, the kind that had no audience, the kind that produced no visible result in the short term, the kind that was simply the daily work of looking at yourself honestly and staying present to what you found. She had been doing this work since the mountain pass. She was not finished. She did not expect to be finished. Finished was not the goal. The goal was continued honest movement in a direction she had chosen with her full intelligence and her full will, in a place that fit, with people who had earned the word trust by demonstrating over time what trust actually required. She understood something she had been circling for weeks. The greatest exile is not the one imposed from outside. It is the one you choose to end, deliberately, after you have understood what you were exiled from and found it insufficient. Seralya had been exiled from her own full presence for 7 years. Present in function, present in intelligence, present in everything that could be observed and used, but not fully, sovereignly, present in the way of a person who claims their own life as their own. She had been living in the margins of someone else's sovereignty and calling it partnership because the margins were substantial and the company was genuine. The moment she left the ring on the floor, she had begun the end of that exile. Every step since. The mountain pass, the coastal road, the 31 days, the receiving room, the declaration, the dock, had been a step further into her own territory. She was not at the edge of that territory anymore. She was somewhere near the center of it, and the center was still being explored, and it was larger than she had expected, and that was good. Dawn came with the clean, hard light of a sky that had been scoured by the departing storm system, as Naeva had said it would. Blue and cold and without the least ambiguity, the kind of morning that does not permit pretense. The east wing caught it full and first, the way good architects intend for the best light to fall on the spaces meant for living rather than display. Therion found her on the marble balcony that looked out toward the sea. He came without announcement and stood beside her, and they watched the light move across the water in the long, horizontal way of early morning light. Unhurried, thorough, finding every surface and showing it in its actual color rather than the artificial warmth of torches. He put his hand on the stone railing beside hers, not touching, beside. She looked at his hand and looked at the sea and felt the whole complicated, honest weight of where she was and who she was standing next to and what had been built in 31 days through nothing more elaborate than two people occupying the same space with complete honesty and no agenda beyond the next correct thing. Naeva came to breakfast this morning, he said. Before I was up? Before anyone was up, he said. She was already at the table when the kitchen staff arrived. She had a book and she was eating bread and she looked... He stopped. She could hear in the pause the specific difficulty of a man trying to describe something that lived in a register beyond his usual precision. She looked like herself, he said finally. The version I remember. Seralya looked at the sea. Children know when a house has changed, she said. They know before adults do. They're still calibrated to what's real rather than what's presented. What changed, he said. She considered the honest answer. The ghost left, she said. Not mine. The one she's been carrying. The belief that the people around her were going to keep leaving or being taken. She paused. I'm here. I said I would be. I came back from the dock. Those are small things that add up to a large thing. He was quiet for a moment. Are you going to stay? He said. Not today. Not this week. I'm asking you what you want your life to look like. This was the question she had been living toward since the mountain pass. Not as destination. She had learned enough about destinations to be suspicious of them, but as direction. The question that organized everything else into orientation rather than chaos. She looked at the sea for a long time. She looked at the harbor below where nothing was blocked and the boats were moving in the ordinary commerce of a morning coast. She looked at the sapphire water and the clean sky and the rock the keep was built on that had been there for longer than the keep and would be there when it was gone. She turned and looked at Therian. He was already looking at her, with the gray eyes and the sea fog patience and the hand beside hers on the railing. I want to build something, she said. Not inherit something. Not advise something. Build it. Here. With you if you want that. On terms that are documented and clear and leave nothing to the good faith of an informal arrangement. She paused. I am done being someone's unofficial anything. He looked at her for a long moment. The council will want a formal appointment, he said. Good, she said. Give them one. Naeva will want a ceremony. She can design it, Seralya said. She'll do a better job than anyone else. The almost smile arrived on his face and became, for the first time in her observation of it, the full thing. Not the structural precursor, but the finished article. The smile of a man who had been patient for the right length of time and had arrived at the thing the patience was for. He turned his hand on the railing so that it was beside hers and covered it. She turned hers. The sea moved below. The morning light came in without apology across the sapphire water, across the pale stone of the keep, across the marble balcony and the two people standing on it with the full, unhurried complexity of their histories and the clean, unambiguous fact of where they were now. There was no ceremony yet. There were no documents yet. There was only this, the morning, the light, the harbor, open and clear, and the beginning of a thing that had not yet been named because it was still being built, and the building of it was its own sufficient meaning. She did not look back. She had learned, on a dark road north from Valtheris, with a glow dying on the horizon behind her, that the spine was a remarkable instrument of will. She kept her eyes forward. The sea ran on. The empire of Valtheris would eventually learn that its most capable advisor had become the co-founder of the coastal kingdom that would, within a generation, surpass it in commercial power and legal sophistication. Historians would argue about the sequence of decisions that produced this outcome. They would attribute it to policy, to geography, to the unique structure of Aurelian's governing council. They would be partly right. What they would never fully account for was the specific weight of 31 days in a keep where someone had handed a frostbitten traveler a cup without asking what she owed for it. The way small acts of honest generosity build the ground on which large things eventually stand. Vaeric ruled for 20 more years, and he ruled differently. The council reforms were implemented in his third year. The distributed authority model was acknowledged. in later political analysis as the structural change that extended Valtheris' stability through what would otherwise have been a period of succession crisis. Elisara built the Southern Coalition into a force that operated on its own terms, and the marriage between her and Vaeric became, with time, and the particular alchemy of two intelligent people who had survived the worst of their beginning, something more honest than what it had started as. He never took the black ring from the imperial vault. He also never moved it. Nyeva grew up and became the kind of leader that only people who read everything and trusted slowly and paid attention to what was real rather than what was performed tend to become. She designed her own coronation ceremony years later when Tharion passed the title to her by choice rather than death. She designed it the way she designed everything, with the minimum necessary ceremony and the maximum possible honesty, in the morning light of the East Wing, before an audience that was small and genuine rather than large and performed. She said in her address that the greatest power she had ever witnessed was not in any throne room but on a dock in winter, in the voice of a woman with no title and no claim who stood at the end of a harbor and said the true thing out loud until the ships moved. She said she had been trying to live at that standard ever since. And Seralya, standing in the audience with Tharion's hand beside hers, felt the stone behind her sternum for the last time in the way she had carried it, as a thing that pressed, as a thing that limited. She felt it change shape one final time, into ground, into the foundation of everything she had built on the other side of the moon chamber, on the other side of the mountain pass, on the other side of a harbor dock, in the last light of a winter evening, everything she had refused to let the wrong season bury. The empire of Aurelian would be spoken of for generations, not for its fear, for what it built when it chose courage over comfort, honesty over performance, and the work of becoming over the easier business of remaining. This was the story. This was what it cost. And this was what it was worth.